Chapter 24. Jack belched as softly as he could. The lamb kidneys on sweet naan had been his favourite dish, but there had been so many that he was fast losing track. The feast, arranged in his honour, was only an hour old, but already his stomach felt fit to burst. Dish after dish had been placed before him by the hundreds of servants charged with seeing to every whim of the Maharajah's guests. As the principal guest, Jack was the first served, and he had felt compelled to take something from every dish offered. They had started to eat just after sunset, and he was now beginning to wonder how he would continue to cope should the feast go on all night. They were delicious. Isabel dabbed at her mouth with a gold silk napkin. She reached across, using it to wipe clean a stain from Jack's mouth. "How's the head?" Jack instinctively raised a finger and poked carefully at the yellow and purple mark in the centre of his forehead. "Not so bad." Isabel smiled. "Well, that's what happens if you are foolish enough to use it as a weapon." As much as she tried to make light of the comment, he saw her distress. She had already witnessed one brutal battle, so she knew what it was for men to fight to the death. She would have some idea of how dangerous the ambush had been, how hard Jack would have had to fight to survive. Jack did his best to return her smile. A servant bowed in front of him as the next dish arrived. He looked at it with caution. He had learnt to be circumspect. He could still taste the effect of the fish on wooden skewers. He had only taken a single mouthful, but it had been so hot that it had felt as if his brains had been blown out of his head. He dipped a small morsel of naan bread to taste what looked to be a quail stew. Reassured, he continued with more freedom, ramming home a few mouthfuls like a gunner double-shotting a cannon. As he ate, he noticed Isabel looking at him. "What?" he asked, raising his own napkin, suspecting he had dribbled some of the stew across his chin. Isabel blushed. "You surprise me." "Surprise you?" Jack scowled. "Do I eat that badly?" "Don't be silly." She smiled. "When I first saw you in Proudfoot's bungalow, I had no idea of the kind of man you are." It was Jack's turn to blush. He sat back in his chair, wincing as the movement jarred his body. He knew he had been lucky to survive the fight with nothing more than bruises and a battered arm, but it still felt as if he had gone a dozen rounds with a backstreet prizefighter. "And now?" Isabel arched her eyebrows. "Now I think you're a fool. We came here to hide, yet you have already saved the life of the Maharajah's only son and been appointed a general in command of his lancers." Jack frowned, sensing mockery. "I did not have much choice in the matter." Isabel laughed aloud. She placed her hand on his forearm. "You keep surprising me, Jack. That is all." The sound of music interrupted their conversation, and the room quietened as a small group of richly dressed men and women were ushered in, singing as they were escorted through the wide double doors. It was a lament, the soft blend of voices merging together in harmony to weave a spell over the hushed audience. Jack listened to the strange music, feeling it resonate deep in his soul. He did not understand the words, but the melody touched a place he had thought hidden, and for a reason he could not fathom he felt the prick of tears at the corner of his eyes. The gentle rhythm of the song faded to silence before the musicians, unseen behind a lattice screen, picked up the tempo. At once the doors to the dining hall were thrown open again, and a troop of Nautch girls bounded in. They raced across the room, moving into position in front of the tables, where the Maharajah's guests clapped and roared with delight as the entertainment took a more lively turn. One girl spun to halt directly in front of Jack. She writhed on the ground, lithe as a panther, her hips thrusting forward before springing to her feet to pirouette so that her back faced him. She gyrated, arching her spine like a cat, before shaking herself with the wanton rhythm of the music. The silk gauze she wore revealed much to his rapt gaze, the sheer fabric stretched tight over her dark body. No part of her was truly naked, save a wide band around her taut midriff, but it was not difficult to imagine how she would look were the flimsy silks whipped away, and Jack had a fine imagination. The hypnotic, pulsating rhythm stopped abruptly, and the girl froze in her pose, every sinew stretched tight as she held the final position of her dance with dramatic poise. The insubstantial costume rose and fell around her chest as she panted with the exertion, a thin shimmer of sweat glistening above the veil that masked the lower half of her face. Jack did his best to ignore the heaving chest inches in front of him and stared into the huge brown eyes that looked at him over the thin veil. The girl matched his appraisal, shameless in front of his scrutiny, her eyes mocking as she saw the man she had danced for transfixed by her supple beauty. A hard wooden fan rapped sharply on Jack's arm, its intricately carved handle turned into an improvised weapon that was used with some force to attract his attention. He turned and saw Isabel arching her eyebrows in his direction. "Do stop staring, Jack." She was clapping her hands with an enthusiasm that was not mirrored in her eyes, which flashed venomously as Jack continued to gaze at the young dancer. "You may also wish to return your tongue to its rightful place in your mouth." He belatedly joined the applause, looking around to see if anyone else had noticed the way the dancer had gripped his attention. The smiles on so many of the faces told him that it had been obvious to all, and he felt his cheeks sting as the inevitable blush spread quickly across them. The girl bowed and trotted away, the dozens of bangles that adorned her wrists and elbows jingling together as she moved. Jack snatched one last look at her bouncing behind before turning to Isabel with as much nonchalance as he could muster. "She was a fine dancer. Did you enjoy her routine?" Isabel raised the fan threateningly. "Don't make me use this again." "I was merely admiring her abilities." "Oh, I'm sure," Isabel said tartly. "And from your avid inspection, I'm certain you found both of them much to your satisfaction." Jack was saved from a reply as the sound of the gong being rung silenced the room. A flurry of activity followed the last reverberation, and an army of servants rushed into the room, arms full of empty platters and steaming bowls of water. They attacked the huge trestle tables with gusto, their practiced hands deftly removing the remains of the feast and cleaning away the mess that the guests had created. In less than a minute, the room was once again immaculate, every trace of the enormous banquet swept and wiped away. The Maharajah got to his feet, and everyone fell silent. In the glow of the 1,000 candles that lit the huge room, he looked like a king from a fairy tale. He was dressed in fabulous crimson robes, for once eschewing the practical garb of a soldier, and was covered in jewellery, some adorning his clothing, still more draped around his neck and smothering his fingers. His head was bound in a plain gold pagdi adorned with a single ruby that was at least the size of Isabel's hand. It was a vivid reminder of his power, and Jack felt the stirring of unease deep in his belly. He was a foreigner in a king's court, beholden to a whimsical ruler he barely knew. The Maharajah began to speak. His voice was deep and he demonstrated obvious charm, clearly relishing being the lead actor on the stage. The audience hung on his every word, as rapt as Jack had been when he had stared so obviously at the young dancing girl. He addressed his court in their own language, But Jack did not have to be able to understand every word to hear the sparkle in his voice, his dramatic pauses and changes in tempo revealing his oratory skill even to a foreigner. Jack stole a glance at Isabel as the Maharajah spoke. She was clearly enthralled. He saw her eyes moisten as the Maharajah dropped his voice to the hushed tones of a man in pain, caught in the emotion of his own words. She was clearly spellbound by the foreign king, and Jack found he could not tear his eyes away from her. He stared in fascination at the base of her throat, the soft, white skin gently pulsating with each beat of her heart. Her wild hair had been tamed for the evening, and it shone in vivid contrast to the dark hair of all the other ladies. She was dressed in the same simple gold sari she had worn the evening before the hunt, and Jack did not think he had ever seen anyone look as beautiful. The Maharajah's voice rose to a climax. His arms spread wide in a dramatic gesture as he brought his speech to a resounding finish, and Jack forced his gaze away before Isabel discovered his intense scrutiny. On cue, 2 lancers strode purposefully into the room. As they marched forward, Jack noticed with mounting horror that every head in the room had turned to stare in his direction. To be the object of such examination was excruciating, his embarrassment surely clearly visible to all. The agonizing sensation was not helped by the Maharajah, who walked towards where Jack sat, his arms spread wide in greeting. As he drew close, he turned and gestured to the audience, encouraging a round of applause. "Stand up, Jack." The Maharajah was close enough to give the order quietly. Jack glanced imploringly in Isabel's direction, as if she could save him from the very public spectacle. But Isabel was little help. She too raised her hands and lifted them to clap in his direction. "Come now, Jack." The Maharajah beamed with happiness as he relished Jack's obvious discomfort. "Enough of the reluctant hero. Try to enjoy the moment." With his face burning, Jack slowly got to his feet, grimacing as the movements encouraged the enthusiastic crowd to redouble their efforts. "There, that wasn't too bad now, was it?" the Maharajah whispered softly, before reaching out to clasp Jack's hands across the table. Then he turned to address his beloved audience once again, keeping Jack's hands held fast in his own. Jack was forced to stand in embarrassed silence as the Maharajah began another dramatic soliloquy. Several gestures were aimed in his direction, and he forced his face into what he hoped was a good-natured smile. Despite not understanding a word of what was said, he did his best to join in, nodding and chuckling when the Maharajah made some quip or wry comment that had his audience guffawing with delight, and trying to look suitably sombre when the king's voice dropped into more emotional tones. Finally, the torture was over, and Jack immediately tried to sit down. The Maharajah was having none of it. He continued to clasp Jack's hands in his own, keeping him on his feet whilst nodding to the pair of lancers to step forward. For the first time, Jack noticed that both carried a blue velvet cushion. On the first was a naked sword which gleamed in the soft candlelight. The blade was decorated with an intricate swirling pattern of letters and designs that flickered and twisted along its length as they caught the light. The grip was wrapped in a beautiful, deep red sharkskin. The craftsman who had made it had given it a practical, workmanlike finish that showed it was a weapon to be used, rather than just worn for ceremony. The guard that would protect the hand was a thing of beauty, and the gleam of a dozen precious stones flashed brightly as the Maharajah finally let go of Jack's sweating grip. The audience hushed as they saw their king look in awe at the beautiful sword. He turned to face Jack before presenting it reverentially forward. "This is for you." The Maharajah had been watching Jack closely. He had read the younger man's emotions as he looked at the weapon, and now he willed him to accept the gift. Jack was struck dumb. The sword alone must have been worth a lifetime of a captain's pay. Yet the second lancer bore a leather scabbard decorated with golden clasps that was also worth a small fortune. Now the Maharajah was offering them both to Jack, who up to that moment had owned nothing save for the clothes he had already been given. Jack reached forward, his hand shaking, and caressed the tip of the sword, the metal cold under his touch. He could feel the tracery of the letters, the delicate script scrolling under his fingers as he ran them down the length of the blade. A spark of avarice suddenly surged unbidden into his heart. He took the red grip in his hand and felt the weight of the sword for the first time. The sour taste of greed dissipated in a heartbeat as he held his reward with all the care of a father holding his firstborn son. He looked up into the Maharajah's eyes and saw the pleasure his taking the sword had given. Jack held a king's ransom in his hands. "No, no, no! How many times must I tell you the same things?" Jack eased back on the reins, bringing his sweat-streaked horse to a stand. He stifled a belch, the spicy reminder of the previous night's feast nearly making him gag. His instructor spurred hard across the dusty ground to stand at Jack's side, his exasperation clear. Jack used the momentary halt to look across to where Isabel sat on her own horse. To his chagrin, he saw the slow shake of her head as she despaired at his lack of progress. He tried to curb the flush of anger that stirred inside him, and lifted one hand from the reins to wipe away some of the sweat that ran down to sting his eyes. At his side, his new sword lay flat against his thigh, the long straps holding it firmly in place no matter how hard he worked his borrowed mount. He still could not believe his good fortune, and he reached down to touch its golden guard, the feel of the cool metal still sending a spark of excitement through his tired body. His riding lesson was taking place in the wide area that separated the Maharajah's palace from the walls of the fortress. It had been designed as part of the fortress's defences, the open space a killing ground should any foe ever succeed in breaching the walls. It was also used as a parade square for the hundreds of men of the Maharajah's army that were garrisoned in the fortress, which also meant it was the place where punishment drills were carried out. Jack was beginning to wonder if any unfortunate soul had ever been made to suffer more than he was, the long riding lesson a torture he would happily have forgone. "Jack, you must listen to the prince. It really is not so difficult." Isabel had ridden over to join in Jack's latest lambasting. His slow progress and lack of natural ability were clearly beyond the understanding of a girl who had learnt to ride as soon as she could walk. Isabel was proving to be a harsher critic than even the maddened prince. "I'm doing my best," Jack growled as he endured another tongue-lashing. He felt he was making fine progress, his confidence in the saddle growing with each long minute of this, the first of what would be many such sessions. But it was clear that his frustrated teachers were not so pleased. "Well, you must try harder." Isabel snapped the words. "You are a savage. You pull too hard, and you kick like an angry peasant. You yank when you should be gentle, and you are gentle when you should be firm." The prince shook his head, once again wondering at the punishment his father had given him. "Feel the horse, Jack. Be sensitive to him. He should be an extension of you. He is not some tool to be used." Isabel leant forward and teased the ears of her own horse, smiling as it flicked its ears at the touch. "Treat him gently." Jack sighed. It was hard to remain calm in the face of such criticism. "Perhaps that is enough for today." "No!" The prince snapped the words with all the authority of the heir to a kingdom. "You will ride again until you get it right." Jack heard the pique in his voice. It was clear the boy wanted the lessons to come to an end quickly. If that meant Jack being ridden into the ground, then that was a small price to pay to end the harsh punishment his father had chosen to inflict. "You are too hard on him." The unexpected voice came from behind Isabel. A rider with the slim body of a young boy rode to join them. "You should not shout at the king's general so. He is a man of much importance." The owner of the voice turned a pair of enormous brown eyes on Jack. He had not expected to find a supporter so close at hand. "Hush, sister. You are not the one instructed to teach this barbarian to ride." The prince was quick to interrupt, yet he beamed with delight as his elder sister pouted at his rash choice of words. It was clear there was much affection shared between the Maharajah's two children. "Barbarian, is it? Is that how you address the man who saved your precious hide?" Lakshmi matched her brother's hectoring tone. The prince had the grace to blush. "I am very grateful for his service, of course." Lakshmi turned the power of her presence on Jack. "You have my brother's gratitude. Let us hope it will prove as useful as the talwar my father presented you with." Jack was lost as he returned the princess's frank and open expression. She was a rare beauty, her tiny features perfectly symmetrical. Her dusky skin shone with vitality, but it was her eyes that captivated him. They were large for her face, two deep, liquid pools, and they sparkled with life. "You will find Jack is a man of few words, Your Highness." Isabel spoke for Jack as he failed to reply. She was clearly comfortable in the princess's company, and from the warm smile Lakshmi shared with her, it was obvious that the two young women had already struck up a friendship. "Enough!" snapped the prince. "We are here to ride, not to gossip like washerwomen." He eased his force forward so that he blocked Jack's view of the two females. "Go round again, and this time do not kick so hard." Jack turned the head of his horse, reluctantly urging the recalcitrant beast into a trot. As he moved away, he twisted in the saddle to flash what he hoped was a dashing smile towards the female part of his audience, keen to show his growing competence. His borrowed mount chose that as the perfect moment to lurch itself into a fast canter, and Jack had to grab hard at the saddle lest he be sent sprawling to the ground. With his ears ringing from the prince's tirade and his face burning with embarrassment, Jack forced his aching thigh muscles to grip the saddle, whilst doing his best to ignore the mocking female laughter that found such delight in his ineptitude. He was a general being taught to ride by a prince under the gaze of a princess. If his breath had not been coming in laboured gasps, he would have laughed at the impossible twist his life had taken. Chapter 25. They are beautiful, are they not? Jack started as the words interrupted his thoughts. He had not heard anyone approach as he studied the series of astonishing paintings that adorned the grand room outside the Maharajah's durbar. He had stolen an hour's solitude and had thought to explore more of the fabulous palace that had become his home. He was fascinated by the magnificent works that were scattered with vulgar abandon throughout the public rooms, the fantastic pieces of art demoted to the role of mere props to impress visitors with the Maharajah's phenomenal wealth. There was something in the intricacy of so many of the objects that intrigued him. Each one had required exquisite skill to produce, and he wondered how their creators would feel to see their precious handiwork displayed on such a vast scale, the minutiae of their tantalizing detail lost in the grand spectacle. It appeared someone had noticed his fascination, and he turned to face the Maharajah's only daughter, his heart pounding. "They are more beautiful than I could ever have imagined was possible. I love these paintings. They are my favourites." Lakshmi stood close enough that Jack could smell the delicate fragrance of her perfume. She was so small that she did not even reach his shoulder. She had all the delicacy of a small bird, but she possessed an aura of confidence that belied her tiny frame. Jack did his best not to stare at her. Instead, he wrenched his eyes away and returned his gaze to the painting in front of him. "Do you understand what it is that you see?" Lakshmi asked, lifting her finger so that it hovered close to the painting, tracing yet not touching the intricate artwork. The many bangles she wore chimed as they slid down her bare arm, revealing the dusky skin beneath. To Jack's fascination, her wrists and hands were decorated with patterns of black henna, an intricate web of fine tracery that curled and twisted across her flesh. It would have been easy to wonder what other surprises lay beneath the pure white sari that was bound tightly around her slight figure, and Jack had to force his mind to study the painting rather than dwell on the fascinating creature at his side. A tiny monkey perched on her shoulder, its wide eyes fixing Jack with a knowing stare as if reading his lustful thoughts. The creature was dressed in a miniature crimson coat, and its ankles were tethered by a delicate golden chain that was held in place by golden rings. The odd little creature chattered incessantly, as if affronted by Jack's interest in its mistress, only hushing when Lakshmi lifted a slender finger and stroked it into gentle submission. "Do they, tell a story?" Jack felt his voice catch in his throat. He hoped Lakshmi could not tell how nervous she made him. "They are by the same hand, that much I can tell." "They are of the Ramayana. They have been in my family for centuries. The Ramayana is a story, a poem, written by the great Valmiki long before the birth of the Christ that you Christians have chosen to worship." "And these depict scenes from the poem?" Jack was intrigued. He wanted to know more, to add to his meagre knowledge, and he wanted to prolong the encounter with the Maharajah's beguiling daughter. Lakshmi nodded. She stared at the picture for some time before speaking again, as if it had been a long time since she had contemplated its fine artistry. "This is from the Yudhakanda, one of 7 books that make up the Ramayana. It tells us how Rama, the favourite son of the great king of Ayodhya, takes his army to fight Ravana, the king of Lanka." Jack wrestled with the strange foreign names that echoed in his head. Lakshmi's accent rolled the sounds around, their rich timbre warm and fascinating. He peered at the picture. "With an army of monkeys?" Lakshmi laughed at his tone. "Yes, with an army of monkeys." Jack liked the way her face flushed as she laughed. "I wish I could remember all this." "I will teach you, if you like. My brother can teach you how we ride. I can teach you of our history. You will need both if you are to prosper as a general in my father's army." Jack watched Lakshmi as she spoke. He was mesmerized by her vitality. He did not think he had ever seen anyone so full of life. "Do all Englishmen stare at women in such a way?" Lakshmi turned her head sharply, her eyes narrowing as she rebuked Jack for his intense scrutiny. Jack blushed and hung his head at being so transparent. "I'm sorry, Your Highness, I didn't—" Lakshmi reached forward and stopped his stuttering apology by placing a single cool finger on his lips. The monkey chirruped and chattered for attention, jealous at seeing its mistress touch another. Lakshmi smiled at the animal's fuss. What a silly creature, getting all hot and bothered so very easily. Jack had a sneaking feeling the princess was talking about him and not about the chattering monkey. He remained silent under her touch, every fibre of his being coming fully alive at the feel of her flesh pressed against his. "Do not apologize, General Lark." She withdrew her hand but continued to stare at Jack's face, a frank look of obvious humour on her face. "I am quite used to such attention. Lakshmi laughed as she spoke. It was a soft sound that emanated from deep in her throat, and Jack immediately smiled in response. "You are the Raj Kumari." He stumbled over the recently learnt word, his clumsy attempts to use Lakshmi's correct title sounding lame even to his own ears. "I am sure it is inevitable." Lakshmi pouted. "So you stare because of the accident of my birth? Not because you consider me beautiful?" Jack saw the sparkle in her eye as she replied. He sensed the danger of talking so freely to the Maharajah's only daughter, yet he could not help his attraction. "You are as beautiful as the morning sun, Your Highness. I cannot imagine a day without the radiance of your presence." Lakshmi snorted in a very unladylike manner at Jack's courtly tongue, causing her pet monkey to start and shriek. She stilled the startled creature with her hand before turning the full weight of her attention back on Jack. "My father was quite wrong. You would make a wonderful ambassador. You are wasted as a general. Your father does not truly know me, Your Highness." "Does anyone?" Lakshmi was suddenly serious. She reached forward and grazed the skin around his eyes with the tip of her finger. Her touch was as light as a feather, and Jack shivered. "I see pain in the lines on your face, General Lark," she continued, her finger sliding gently down his face so that it traced along his jawline. "The stain of suffering that should not scar a face as young as yours." Jack could not speak. His face tingled where her finger had been, the gossamer lightness of her touch inflaming his soul. Lakshmi stepped back, Jack's skin suddenly cold as she withdrew her touch. "You are an interesting man, General Lark. You intrigue me." Jack had to clear his throat before he could speak. He was certain Lakshmi could see the desire on his face, the lust that had charged into his eyes when he felt her touch on his skin. "I am pleased you find me so fascinating, but I am not a painting to be studied." His shame made him harsh. "Oh, I know that." Lakshmi flushed crimson as she spoke, her eyes suddenly downcast as if she was ashamed of her own behaviour. "No one will ever be able to own you." Without another word she turned and walked quickly away, her small bare feet whispering across the marbled floor with barely a sound. Jack watched her go, his emotions in turmoil. Lakshmi fascinated him. She was beautiful and exotic, and he couldn't help but be attracted to her. She beguiled him in a way that Isabel never could. But he had made his choice the moment he agreed to go on an afternoon's picnic to visit a crumbling stone tower. His head might be turned, but his heart could not be. The sound of laughter echoed down the passageway, the hard marble floor and the wooden panels on the wall making the sound reverberate, so that Jack heard it clearly even though he was still yards away from the source of the frivolity. He turned the corner to see Prince Abhishek standing on one leg in front of a clearly delighted Isabel. The boy's antics were obviously the source of the warm sound of amusement, and Isabel was clapping her hands together with glee at his jests. "What is going on here?" Jack snapped the question in the commanding tone of a British Army officer. The prince started, the sudden interruption nearly causing him to lose balance. A fleeting look of guilt flashed across his face, like a schoolboy who had been caught cheating at a game of cards. Jack understood the expression at once. He made a mental note to keep a close eye on the Maharajah's son. "Jack!" Isabel bounced with girlish glee as Jack strode into view. Prince Abhishek was imitating his uncle's favourite pet monkey. The poor thing only has one leg and must hop everywhere. Jack had a pretty shrewd idea that the prince had been thinking of a different kind of antic, and the bright crimson flush on the boy's cheeks confirmed his suspicions. He was not the only one becoming infatuated with a foreign woman. The prince held his hands together in front of his body as Jack approached, nervous to have been discovered cavorting with his father's guest. Jack made sure to look the younger man firmly in the eye, unconsciously straightening his spine to emphasize the difference in their heights. "Your Highness is a fine comedian." He spoke the words through gritted teeth. The boy recognized the tension in the words and dropped his eyes, suddenly fascinated by the intricate veins in the marbled floor beneath his feet. Isabel laughed at Jack's heavy flattery. She saw nothing of the challenge in his posture or in the veiled menace of his tone. "Prince Abhishek has been regaling me with so many stories. Why, Jack, you would not believe half of them." Jack smiled, keeping his eyes firmly on the top of the prince's head. "I'm certain the prince knows how to tell a story. All boys of his age have a fine imagination." The prince looked up and quailed as he saw the older man's heavy scrutiny. "Please, excuse me. I must attend on my father." He quickly muttered the polite phrase before scuttling away, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. Jack watched him leave, a wry, mocking smile on his face. For the first time, Isabel noticed his mood. "Have I done something wrong?" She moved forward, placing a hand on Jack's arm. He had unthinkingly taken a firm hold on the hilt of the sword at his hip. "You? No. But you should keep an eye on that boy." "On Prince Abhishek? Why, he's charming. Why should I be concerned about him?" "I have a notion he would like to be not so charming. And he's no boy. He has the emotions of a man, and I rather fancy you've stirred some passion in him." "Jack!" Isabel stepped back as if horrified at the base observation, her mouth open in amazement. But the look on her face told Jack she was not totally put out at the notion of being the object of a prince's desire. "How can you say such a thing?" Jack snorted at the veiled innocence. "He's a young man. You are a blonde angel like no one he has ever seen. He cannot but be infatuated." Isabel stamped her foot. "That is not so. You're just saying it to be spiteful." "Don't be so ridiculous. I'm letting you know so you don't encourage him." "Encourage him? Why on earth would I encourage him?" Isabel looked at Jack through hooded eyes. "Why? I think you're jealous." "Jealous? Of a whippersnapper who's only just stopped having some nanny wipe his arse?" Jack chuckled as if amused by the notion. "I'm not jealous. I'm simply concerned that you do not know what you're doing when you flutter your eyelashes at the poor boy." Isabel's temper was rising. "How dare you? Why, it's at times like this that I'm reminded of how coarse you really are." "I may be coarse, but at least I'm able to see what's staring me right in my damn face." "Oh, really?" Isabel moved forward, wagging her finger inches in front of Jack's nose. "So, what of the princess? Don't think I haven't seen how you moon over her." "Now who is jealous?" He raised his hand and used it to push Isabel's wagging finger to one side. Isabel's mouth opened and closed several times, but she was unable to speak. With a final grunt of barely suppressed anger, she turned sharply on her heel and stamped away down the passageway. Jack felt a pang of regret. He had no desire to hurt Isabel, but his building infatuation with the beguiling Lakshmi had made him feel guilty. Mixed with a little jealousy, it fermented a cocktail that he had been powerless to control. "General Lark!" A voice called his name, interrupting his train of thought. He pushed the difficult emotions away and forced a smile onto his face. It felt odd to be addressed as General, but he had a feeling he could get used to it. "So, you have been given my lancers." Count Piotr strode jauntily across the marble, the spurs on his high black boots jangling with every step. There was no trace of animosity in his words. "I have to learn to ride first." "Yes, you must," the Count laughed as he replied. "I cannot have my men led by a damn infantryman." "I shall do my best." Count Piotr nodded in agreement. He was watching Jack closely, as if considering something. "Whatever you have to say, just say it." Jack was blunt. The confrontation with Isabel had worn his patience thin. The Count's eyes narrowed. "Very well. You are an astute man, Jack, for all your attempts to portray yourself as nothing more than a humble soldier." He paused, his brow furrowed. "Did you stop to ask yourself why you have been given the command of the finest men in the Maharajah's army?" Jack smelt trouble. "No." His answer was wary but honest. The Count snorted once before he replied, "I thought so. It is a fitting reward for a man as brave as you, no?" "Perhaps." "Did you think on what had happened to the man who had commanded them before you?" "No." Jack had been too wrapped up with his spectacular rise to give the matter serious thought. What happened to him? "He was deemed to be too old to continue in his command, past his usefulness. You have replaced him." Jack heard the bitterness in the revelation. "I'm sorry. I did not intend to force you from your position." To Jack's surprise, the Count laughed again. "You are a quick-witted fellow, Jack. Perhaps you will do well in your new role." His face changed, his expression suddenly serious. "I do not begrudge you commanding my men, but you would do well to think on your life here. Are you being rewarded for valor, or are you a bauble, an adornment that satisfies the Maharajah's fancy?" He waved his arm, indicating the dozens of fabulous objects scattered around the corridor in which they talked. "He has many trinkets. They interest him for one day, perhaps a week." He fixed Jack with an intense stare, and then he tires of them. Jack understood immediately. The Polish Count was warning him for a second time. "So, what happens to you now?" Again the Count laughed. "You must not worry about an old man. I'm still here. I shall still advise the great king, although I am not so sure he will listen to me. But he has not fully tired of me, for the moment at least." He chuckled as if amused at a joke only he had heard, before he turned on his heel and walked away. Jack watched him go. He would heed the Count's warning. He would take nothing for granted. As long as he served the Maharajah, he would be on his guard. Chapter 26. Jack stood in the white durbar room, trying to look composed and assured. The chamberlain had positioned him near the Maharajah's simple throne, in full view of anyone entering the room. The richly dressed noble to his left had taken a self-conscious step to one side as Jack arrived, leaving him to stand quite alone. He was dressed in another new uniform, the tailored lancer's coat now adorned with the thick white epaulets of a general in the Maharajah's service. Yet today the fine blue officer's jacket felt tight around his chest, and the waistband of the new white breeches cut deeply into the flesh around his stomach. Even the tall black boots he had worn for several weeks now pinched across the instep, the highly polished leather suddenly tight and unyielding. His discomfort was made worse as it dawned on him that he had been positioned with care. He was supposed to be seen, his presence in the durbar arranged with calculated design. The last weeks had passed quickly. Jack had been made to work for his keep. He had spent countless hours under the uncompromising tutelage of the Maharajah's son, learning to ride and gaining the skills he would need to fight in battle from the back of a horse. As he progressed, he had begun to spend more time with the blue-coated lancers. At first he had been thrust into their ranks, trusted with nothing more than learning the complex mounted drill that Count Piotr had passed on to the Maharajah's favourite troops. He had accompanied them on long marches through the Maharajah's domains, hardening his muscles and broadening his knowledge of the lands and the people of Sawad. As he became more accomplished, he had begun to take his position at the head of the lancers, slowly starting to live up to the grandiose title that had been bestowed upon him. He was nearing the point where he would be able to influence his command, moving from student to teacher, passing on what he had learnt of battle, of what it took to translate the manoeuvres and drills from the parade ground to the battlefield. The rest of his time had been spent with Lakshmi and Isabel, exploring the palace and learning more of the country that sheltered them from the righteous anger of the British authorities. The friendship that had developed between the two young women fascinated him. He would stare at them as they wandered the corridors and rooms of the fortress, arm in arm, talking 10 to the dozen, as if they had known each other all of their lives. He did not understand how they had established such a strong bond, but somehow it made it easier for him, his fascination with Lakshmi neutered with Isabel present. Not that he had the energy to even think of anything untoward, the hours spent with the Maharajah lancers sapping him of the necessary energy and strength. He looked around the Durbar room, trying to remember the names of all who were present, just one of the many things he was struggling to learn as he took his place as one of the Maharajah's inner circle of advisers. His heart was pounding in his chest as he waited for those who had come demanding an audience with the Maharajah. He sensed that his future hung on the events of the next hour. The calm of recent weeks had dulled his anxiety, the simple pleasure of life in the Maharajah's court allowing him to put his concerns for the future to one side. Now the urgent summons to the Durbar room mocked such complacency. The Maharajah lounged on his simple throne. He was dressed in the unassuming shirt and breeches of a soldier, only the fabulous golden silk cravat revealing any flamboyance. Every insouciant gesture reaffirmed his lack of concern, as if the meeting that was about to take place was as mundane as dealing with the trivial arguments solved by his junior ministers. Yet Jack had known him long enough to see the anxiety in his eyes. The Maharajah might have presented the calm facade of a man fully in control of his destiny, but Jack sensed the tension that was building within. The Maharajah was right to be concerned, for the official delegates of the British government had arrived unannounced and demanded an immediate audience. He could not ignore the men who governed his land under the terms of the treaty signed by his father. As for Jack, he would have to stand in full view as Major Proudfoot ventured into his enemy's lair. For good or for ill, he was about to come face to face with his former commanding officer. The large doors swung open, the two guards standing rigidly to attention as the British deputation strode purposefully into the Durbar. The sudden flash of their scarlet coats jolted Jack, and he felt a tremor of shame deep within his belly. He was wearing the uniform of a foreign power, and for the first time he felt like a traitor. Proudfoot marched towards the Maharajah's throne. Jack could see the Major's face set into a purposeful scowl, the look of a schoolmaster before he administered the cane to an errant yet deserving boy. He walked with the air of a man in charge, as if he, not the man who lolled in the room's only chair, were the rightful ruler of Sawad. Lieutenant Fenris followed Proudfoot into the room. He caught Jack's eye, the sudden flare of recognition quickly replaced by a look of such loathing that it momentarily stunned Jack with its force. He had known that the junior officer had become his enemy, but he was still struck by the power of the hatred that emanated from the younger man. Proudfoot himself glanced across at Jack for no more than a single heartbeat before he bowed to the Maharajah and began to speak. "Thank you for agreeing to see us at such short notice, sire. The pleasure is all yours, I am sure." The Maharajah still lounged on his throne, one leg thrown casually over its arm. He looked thoroughly bored, and Jack wondered what emotions were hidden behind the mask of supercilious disdain. "Indeed it is, sire." Proudfoot did not bat an eyelid at the rude remark. "I trust we find your highness in the very best of health." "I am full of the joys of spring, Proudfoot, much, I am sure, to your disappointment." "I am delighted to hear it, sire. I hope that the rest of your family is equally healthy." "If you have come all this way merely to ask after the health of every Tom, Dick, and Harry who lives in this damned palace, then you have had a wasted trip." Some of the Maharajah's tension escaped as he tired of Proudfoot's insincere inquiries. He twisted athletically in his chair, swinging his leg around so that he sat facing forward. "I would ask you to say what you have come to say. I'm a busy man." "Very well, sire. As you demand." Proudfoot turned and gestured for Fenris to hand him a roll of cream parchment that the younger officer had carried into the durbar. "I have come to deliver this document." The Maharajah chuckled. "You British set such stock by documents. What of a man's word? Is that not enough any more?" "Such things must be done correctly, sire." "What things?" The Maharajah gestured impatiently for the parchment to be handed to him. Proudfoot passed it over and then stood back, his face betraying an air of arrogant satisfaction. It was quickly replaced by irritation as the Maharajah casually tossed the rolled parchment over his shoulder. "I would rather you simply told me what's in it, old boy," he said, lounging back on his throne. Proudfoot looked longingly at the discarded parchment. He took a moment to compose himself and still any outward sign of temper. "Of course, sire. I am afraid I am the bearer of sad tidings. Have you heard of the doctrine of lapse?" Jack's heart had been pounding ever since Proudfoot had begun to speak. The dry legal phrase stilled it in an instant. The Maharajah sat forward in his chair, his attempt at nonchalance abandoned. "I'm familiar with the term, though I do not understand why you would mention it." His tone was icy. The court froze as if every person drew in breath as one. "That is why I am here, sire." Proudfoot thrived on the attention, hostile as it was. "The governor has ordained that, due to your lack of satisfactory evidence to the contrary, he must assume you to have no heir." Jack stared in fascination at the Maharajah. There was no trace of emotion on his face. Where a lesser man would have leapt to his feet, roaring in indignation, he sat still and composed, only the hard, flat stare an indication of the emotions that were raging inside. "I see." The Maharajah said nothing further, simply sat where he was, his attention fixed on the political officer standing in front of him. No one dared speak. Jack watched as Proudfoot rode out the storm of silence, his own composure matching that of the Maharajah. Only Fenris seemed uncomfortable, visibly squirming as the uncomfortable hiatus went on. "There has been a mistake," said the Maharajah finally, in the quiet tones of a reasonable man, his delivery careful and deliberate. "I am sure the governor is very busy, and is poorly guided in this matter. There has never been any doubt that I am blessed with 2 children, both of whom are more than able to rule here in my stead when I am gone. The doctrine of lapse cannot," he paused before continuing, "shall not be applied here." Proudfoot smiled, without any trace of warmth in his expression. "There has been no mistake, sire. We have been given no proof that the children you mention are indeed your own. If you were able to produce their mother—" "She died in childbirth." The Maharajah snapped the words. "Not even a king can raise the dead." Proudfoot gave no sign of embarrassment. "Then we have no choice, sire. In cases such as this, the doctrine must be applied. The governor has been magnanimous in allowing you to be apprised of the situation so that you are able to make—" He paused, matching the Maharajah's style of delivery, "suitable arrangements." The Maharajah contemplated Proudfoot's words. "So, I must provide proof that my children are indeed my own. Or should I simply sire more heirs? Perhaps you would like to nominate someone to bear witness as I perform the necessary act." Proudfoot shuddered with distaste at the notion. "There is no need for such excess, sire. So, when I am dead, the British will rule the land that has been ours for centuries." Proudfoot spread his hands apologetically and shrugged. "The governor would deem that the best course of action, sire." "And if I resist?" The Maharajah spoke in no more than a whisper, yet every ear in the room heard his words. "That would be—" Again Proudfoot paused, as if sucking each word to check it was not too peppery. "Ill-advised. As you will be aware, we have recently applied the doctrine successfully elsewhere, and it would really be better for everyone concerned if it were also to be applied here, though only at the proper time, of course." "When I am conveniently dead, you mean?" The Maharajah gave a mocking smile. "I admire boldness, Proudfoot. You are nothing if not bold." Proudfoot held out his hands in apology. "We merely seek to do what is right, sire, what is best." For a moment Jack was certain the Maharajah would unleash his temper. He could see the rage flashing across his eyes, but it was nothing more than a fleeting glimpse of the man's true feelings. Somehow the emotion was contained. "We will consider what you have said. I must thank you for taking the time to deliver this message to me personally." Proudfoot bowed at the waist. "It was my pleasure." He made no attempt to hide his satisfaction. Jack would have gained a great deal of pleasure from slamming his fist into the centre of the man's smug face and seeing how pleased he looked then. Fenris leaned forward and whispered into Proudfoot's ear, shooting a venomous look in Jack's direction as he did so. Proudfoot nodded as if reminded of a minor item he had overlooked. "There is one other small matter, Your Highness, if I may." The Maharajah fluttered his fingers to acknowledge the request. "Thank you. I'm afraid this is a delicate matter, and one that is somewhat, again the annoying pause, embarrassing." "Go on." "It has come to our attention that there is a criminal at large. He is a man who is adept at the art of masquerade, and he has been able to dupe a number of unfortunate souls with his evil cunning. To my shame, I must admit that I myself was one of them." Proudfoot looked across at Jack before returning his gaze to the Maharajah. If he hoped to see any sign of encouragement, then he was to be disappointed. "He has gone to great lengths to hide his deception, and he will stoop to any depths to avoid being brought to justice. I am afraid to report that this has included deceiving an innocent young girl and encouraging her to accompany him on his foul mission." "I have no idea of what you speak." The Maharajah's voice hardened. I shall have my men inform you should this miscreant make the mistake of trying to dupe me." He looked at Jack and gave him a very obvious and unsubtle wink. "Sire, I am not a fool." Proudfoot spoke in little more than a whisper. "The man stands in plain view." "He does?" The Maharajah made a show of looking around the Durbar room. "I see no one who does not belong here." There was a warning in his tone that was quite lost on Lieutenant Fenris, who was unable to contain himself any longer. "He stands right there, as bold as brass." Fenris's anger made him quiver with indignation, his finger pointing directly at where Jack stood in silence. The Maharajah turned the force of his attention on the young lieutenant. "That man is my trusted general. You are mistaken, Lieutenant Fenris." There was naked venom in his voice now, and Proudfoot stepped forward, placing himself between his errant subaltern and the ruler. "Very well, sire, as you will. But I would beg you to inquire after the young girl. We believe this insidious man had inveigled her into his evil scheme. She should be returned to her father. I would hope you would understand that." For the first time, the Maharajah seemed to accept the political officer's words. "I shall see that the lady in question is asked for her opinion on the matter, should the situation arise." Lieutenant Fenris opened his mouth to object, but Proudfoot preempted another outburst by placing a warning hand on the officer's arm. "Thank you, sire. We can ask for nothing more." Jack had stood mute throughout the exchange. It would have been easy to remain silent, safe in the knowledge that the Maharajah was protecting him. But he could not stand back and say nothing. He would not hide. He stepped forwards, his spine tingling with discomfort as every eye turned towards him. "Proudfoot." The Major looked surprised that Jack had chosen to speak. He quickly glanced in the Maharajah's direction, checking for any sign of intervention. Seeing that none was forthcoming, he turned and faced his fellow countryman, lifting his chin in a supercilious gesture of disdain. "I have nothing to say to a traitor." "I'm no damn traitor." Jack felt his emotions surge through him. He had not imagined how difficult it would be to speak to the British officer, to face his own side whilst wearing the uniform of another. "I can call you nothing else. You should do the decent thing and turn yourself in, and allow Miss Young Summers to be returned to the care of her father. It is the only chance you have of avoiding the noose." "I'm to be hanged?" Jack did not sound surprised. He'd always known the penalty for this charade. "It's what you deserve, you damned villain." Fenris hissed the words, his anger naked. "You should quieten your lapdog, Proudfoot, before he bites off more than he can chew." Fenris stiffened, but Proudfoot once again placed a warning hand on his arm, silencing the furious younger officer. "Did you have something you wanted to say?" Proudfoot was urbane in the face of his subaltern's righteous anger. "You should tell Reverend Youngsummers that his daughter is safe and well. I would not want him to be unduly worried." "How magnanimous of you!" Proudfoot's sarcasm was obvious. He turned as if about to leave, before pausing, struck by a sudden thought. "You know, it really is a pity I had not known of your true abilities when we first met. I would have found use for a man of your resourcefulness." He shook his head, clearly disappointed by the missed opportunity. "Would you allow me to know your real name?" He asked the question with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I should like to be able to address you properly." "Lark. My name is Jack Lark." For a moment, Jack was tempted to offer his hand, but he held back, still unsure of Proudfoot's motives. But Proudfoot simply nodded, Lark. A good name for a man who commits his life to such wild escapades. He looked up and gave Jack a mocking half-smile. Well met, Jack Lark. Then he turned on his heel, ushering the still enraged Lieutenant Fenris out with him. Jack watched him go. To his surprise, he felt a strong sense of regret. Chapter 27. You must accept, Your Highness. To do anything else would be folly. Count Piotr sat ramrod straight in his chair, and offered his opinion in the flat, dry tone of someone who regarded any other course of action as simple madness. I shall never accept. Never! The Maharajah slammed his fist down onto the thick mahogany table that had been painted a brilliant shade of white. The Count was unfazed at the display of temper. He sat back in his chair on the other side of the round table and stroked his thin moustache. You cannot fight them. Why not? The Maharajah leapt to his feet and stalked around the room. The small, intimate chamber was decorated with wooden panels painted dark crimson that stood in stark contrast to the plain marble floor and crisp white ceiling. Unlike so many of the rooms in the palace, there was little else in the way of decoration. The plain, workmanlike feeling was echoed in the placement of the many console tables around the room, their highly polished surfaces covered with paper, inkwells, quills and blotters. But there was no clerk present that day to record what was said. The Maharajah had summoned his closest advisers to discuss the news delivered by Major Proudfoot, and their words were to remain closely guarded, known only to the participants in the secret durbar. For they talked of war, the modest room bearing witness to a discussion that would decide the fate of a nation. Jack watched closely as the Maharajah stalked around the chamber. With no strangers present, he was able to give vent to his feelings. It was a miracle that he had been able to contain the full force of his rage during the audience with the British officials. Jack had seen the ruler of Saward many times before today. He had enjoyed their conversations, but they had often been inconsequential, jokey affairs, the Maharajah revealing nothing of his opinions or his aspirations for his domain. For all his grandiose titles and fabulous uniforms, Jack was still the outsider, still the Farangi. He had not forgotten Count Piotr's warning, and he had done his best to remain wary, to not become too comfortable or complacent in his new life. Now, for the first time, he had been summoned to join the Maharajah's inner circle of advisers, his council of war. He did not know what role he would be expected to take, so he guarded his emotions, keeping his face neutral as he waited to discover if he would be asked for advice or whether he was there to offer information. He recognized only 3 of the other men summoned to join the intimate council. One was Count Piotr, who had surprised everyone by being the first to offer the one piece of advice that was sure to set the touch paper to the Maharajah's temper. On the far side of the table sat the vizier, the man who had been so keen to see Jack executed when he had first arrived at the fortress. It was he who was to speak next, the rotund official beginning a long, passionless speech in his own language. To his left sat 2 other dark-faced advisers, who both nodded enthusiastically at the course of action that was being suggested by their colleague. The 3 men were clearly used to each other, and they formed a cohort that would offer a single opinion, even if it were delivered from 3 separate mouths. It was obviously a forceful argument, and the pace of the Maharajah's angry tread slowed as he contemplated what was being said. Jack sincerely hoped that the vizier was advising the Maharajah to not contemplate open rebellion against the British. He knew that this would place him fully in the role of traitor, yet it was not solely through a notion of self-preservation that he so desired the Maharajah to find a peaceful solution to Proudfoot's plans for his dynasty. For Jack was certain that if the Maharajah decided to fight the British, he was doomed to defeat. Count Piotr spoke again. "If you fight, sire, you will die, and your ambition and your dynasty will be so much dust." Jack envied his calm manner. It was a bold man who addressed a king so. He was intrigued to hear that the Polish count's opinion matched his own, glad that he was not the only one who saw the certainty of defeat. "Why? Explain to me why I cannot defeat the British. My army is bigger than theirs. I have more horsemen and many more foot." The Maharajah came to a stop next to the Count, leaning forward to take his weight onto his arms as he sought the answer to his earnest question. "Why must I stay my hand when I could defeat these fools with ease?" "Because the British do not understand defeat," the Count replied quietly. "They refuse to be beaten. No matter how many times you fight them, they will always return, and each time they will be stronger. You can win a battle, maybe two. You cannot win a war." But the Maharajah did not agree. "They will understand defeat soon enough. I will destroy them and their stupid little town. I will show them what happens when they treat the Maharajah of Sawad with such disdain." "Then you would be a fool," the Count snapped the reply. The quiet room fell into a deathly silence as one of their number dared to confront the passionate ruler. The only man who seemed unconcerned was the Count himself, and he leant forward, taking firm hold of one of the Maharajah's forearms. "If you fight them, you will bring down a retribution such as you cannot begin to contemplate. The British cannot allow you to strike at them for fear of the example it would set. Even if you win and destroy their station at Bundapur, they will come at you with such power that you will be lucky if a single man in your army is left alive." Jack watched the faces around the room. The two dark-faced advisers were animated, their loud voices denying the Polish cavalryman's words. The vizier sat in silence, his eyes lifted to the heavens as if he summoned divine intervention. Yet his expression remained guarded, and Jack got the sense that behind his calm facade his mind raced in calculation. "We can call on at least 1,000 cavalry, and more than double that number of foot soldiers." A grey-haired man who had so far remained silent consulted a piece of parchment on the table in front of him. "The British have fewer than 100 of their own men, and around 300 native soldiers, a squadron of cavalry, and no cannon. I see no reason why we should be afraid of that force." There was no judgment in his voice, merely the matter-of-fact tone of a man seeking orders. He was dressed in the same blue and red uniform that Jack had seen on the guards who had first granted him access to the palace, and the Maharajah listened intently as he spoke. "That is but a fraction of their forces." The Count's respectful manner made it clear that he too valued the older man's opinion. "Destroy those and more will come. They will bring cavalry and cannon. They will reduce this place to so much rubble. It has happened before and it will happen again. There is no hope of resistance." "We could call on our allies. Not the Khan or the Maharajah of Orkha could double the size of our army if we so wished." The old man looked at the Maharajah as he spoke, presenting the option with no hint of whether he agreed with it or not. "Those jackals!" The Maharajah did not bother to hide his own opinion. "They would only join us if they thought they would be able to pick over our carcass. I will not ask for help." His voice betrayed his pride. The old officer nodded, the first sign of his own feelings revealed. "Your army will fight if you command us, Your Highness. I do not doubt we would succeed against this man, Proudfoot, and his troops." He looked across at the Count. "But I cannot say if we can defeat this white-faced horde that Count Piotr describes." "We must fight!" The final voice in the room spoke. It belonged to the third man that Jack had recognised. Prince Abhishek joined the conversation for the first time, his young face flushed with passion. "We cannot accede to this demand. My ancestors fought for this land. They took it by being strong, and they kept it by being stronger. We cannot sit back like women and let these British just take it all away." The Maharajah smiled with pride. "You speak from your heart, my son. It does you credit." He turned and looked around the room, resting his unsettling gaze for a moment on every face. He came to Jack. "General Lark, you have been uncharacteristically quiet. What is your opinion?" Jack felt a lump form in his throat as the Maharajah's attention fell upon him. There was nowhere to hide in the small room. He was an impostor, yet now he was being asked to advise on the fate of a nation. The Count is correct." He had to clear his throat as he began to speak. "You cannot defeat us. The men at Bundapur are well trained and well armed. If you attack, then they will stand and they will fight harder than you can believe is possible." Jack's confidence grew as he began to string his sentences together. "I do not believe you will succeed in destroying the station at Bundapur. I think you will commit many men to certain death if you try. When you are defeated, the British will annex your land and rule here in your place. There will be no place for your son, and you will both be hunted down like dogs until you're brought to heel or killed in the process. The Count is right. To fight us is folly." The Maharajah's son rose to his feet, indignation clear on his young face. "This man knows nothing. He is a charlatan, a trickster. He says these things to frighten us, to save his countrymen from facing death at our hands." He pointed a finger at Jack as he spoke. "We should not listen to his false words." "I hear you, my son." The Maharajah smiled warmly at Abhishek's passion. "Now sit and calm yourself." He turned back to Jack. Once again every set of eyes fell on him. "Why?" The question was simple, and asked in the voice of a man searching for understanding. "Why can you British not just leave us alone?" For the first time Jack heard the pain in the Maharajah's voice, and he felt a prick of shame. "I do not know. Your son is correct. I'm an impostor. I'm not a politician." The Maharajah seemed disappointed by the meek answer. He pulled back from the table and began to once again pace around the room. The men left at the table sat in silence, each contemplating their own thoughts, none willing to look at one another as they waited. "My father faced this same question when I was but a small boy." The Maharajah began to speak as he paced, circling around the table, fixing each man with his firm gaze as he walked opposite their place. "He signed the treaty with the British because he believed he could not stand against their power, just as many others did. Yet my father was old then. He had lost the fire in his belly. Now the British are back and they want more. They want me to hand over the lands of my forefathers to them." He stopped his pacing, coming to a halt on the opposite side of the table to where Jack sat. Jack looked up into the fierce gaze and saw the anger in the Maharajah's eyes, the indignation of a man faced with injustice, the fury of a ruler about to send his country to war. "The British want me to do as I'm told, to go quietly and to accept the fate they have chosen for me. How little do they know me." The Maharajah paused. For a moment his head hung, as if the discussion had exhausted him, the enormity of the decision he faced physically weighing him down. Then he looked up. "I shall not go meekly." He stared at Jack, his eyes suddenly hard. "I shall fight for my kingdom. I shall make the British regret their decision. If nothing else, I shall live what time is left to me in honour." Jack met the uncompromising gaze. "You are wrong. There is no honour in sending men to their deaths. There is just pain and suffering." The Maharajah coloured. "Perhaps death is better than living in shame. Perhaps for you. But your men do not have that choice. You will send them to their deaths for what? For your honour, for glory? For it is they who will suffer. It is they who will die." Jack felt his own temper rising. He had known what it was to be ordered into battle. He had known what it was like to be a pawn in the game of war. "The men will fight for their king willingly." The old officer spoke for his troops. "They would die for their king." Prince Abhishek was more forceful, his face flushed crimson with his righteous anger as he leapt to his feet, his temper forcing him into motion. Jack refused to be cowed. "They will fight because you order it. Do not be so quick to condemn men to death. Their lives mean more than that." "You speak well, General Lark." The Maharajah waved Abhishek back into his seat. "You are right to question these things. But my son is correct. My country would rather die than become another vassal of your queen. You are still a stranger here, no matter what the colour of your uniform. You do not understand us. You British, you look at us and see our ignorance. You look down your noses and see squalor, hear laws that do not make sense. But you do not see our souls. You do not see the lives that have been lived here for centuries. Oh, I'm sure you wish to improve us. You are certain that your roads and your universities and your schools and even your great white God will improve our lives. But I tell you this, we do not want your improvements. We do not want your hands in our lives. We will live as we have chosen, or we would rather die." The Maharajah vibrated with passion. Jack heard the raw emotion and it struck home. He truly did not know these people. "I warned you that this day would come, General Lark." The Maharajah wiped a hand over his bald scalp, as if smearing away his emotions. "We will go to war. Your precious redcoats are now my enemy. You must decide which side you are on." Chapter 28. Jack sat in the room of the Ramayana paintings, savouring the peace and the solitude. It had become one of his favourite places in the palace. It was tucked away, far from the bustle of the public areas. He could sit alone, setting his mind free, testing the darkness within, something in the tranquillity of the room allowing him to dare to venture into his memories. He could not resist picking at the scabs in his soul, the itch of what had been simply too strong to ignore. Only the subtle tick of a fine gold clock broke the quiet. Yet his mind reverberated to the sounds of battle, replaying the horror of marching into enemy fire, the icy rush of fear flushing through him as he remembered taking his sword forward into the vicious melee of combat. The Maharajah had called for war. Jack felt that he alone knew what was coming. No one else was capable of recognizing the monster that was being summoned so willingly. The knowledge shamed him, and he could not help chastising himself for not having spoken out more forcefully against the bloodshed that was sure to come. He knew he had not done enough to avoid the conflict that was now inevitable. His hand dropped to the talwar at his side. The sharkskin grip was still clean, not yet sullied by his sweat or by the blood of other men. If war came, then the sword would be forced into service, its master given the opportunity to show his true worth. For in the darkest recess of Jack's mind lurked the pride of what he became when battle was joined. He was an impostor, a charlatan, but in battle he was able to show the steel that lived underneath the folds of his assumed roles. Only then could he reveal his bitter talent. He might have wished for a peaceful resolution to British ambition, but he knew he would not avoid the battle if it came. He heard the chatter of the monkey and quickly got to his feet. Yet it was hard to shake off the world of canister and volley fire, even as he listened to the sound of bare feet whispering across the marble floor, the gentle chink of a slim gold chain as the beast it tethered capered on the shoulder of its mistress. "General Lark." Lakshmi's dusky voice cut through the echo of gunfire in his mind. Yet it sounded muffled, the cries of the dead deafening the voice of the living. Even the delicate fragrance of her perfume did nothing to shake off the feeling of dread that was coursing through him. She reached for his arm. Her hand was cool on his skin, and he tried to focus on the gentle touch. But the bitter memories were strong, and he felt distant, lost in a world of death. "Jack?" Lakshmi's voice was small. She stood on tiptoe, leaning forward so that the wide silk hood of her dress whispered across his face. She kissed him on the cheek, her lips barely brushing his skin. Jack felt a frisson of desire spark in his heart. It drove away the haunting shadows, bringing him back to the present. "Where were you, General Lark?" To Jack's regret, she had pulled back, but the chill was gone, banished by the warmth of her lips. Jack smiled. "I was far away. Thank you for rescuing me." "You seem to be making a habit of being rescued by the women in your life." Lakshmi mocked him, yet her eyes remained guarded, doubtful that he had still not fully come back to the world of the living. "I'm a lucky man." Jack reached for her hand. It was tiny, the delicate fingers fragile in his grip. "You are a bold man, that much is certain." Lakshmi gently chided Jack for his forwardness, but she left her hand in his all the same. "Per aspera ad astra." Jack's tongue tripped over the Latin phrase, but he was pleased his attempt made her smile. "Through difficulties to the stars," Lakshmi translated with ease. "You truly do have the tongue of a diplomat." A madman I once knew said it. He was trying to inspire us before we went into battle. "Did it work?" "We won. Maybe it did." "You won." There was sarcasm in Lakshmi's voice now. She snatched her hand back. "You men talk of winning and losing, but there is no victory in battle. There is just pain and suffering and death." "I don't want war." Lakshmi looked deep into his eyes. "No. I sense the pride in you. You want this as much as my father does." Jack shivered as she read his soul. "You are wrong." He made the denial bitterly, unable to reveal how close she had come to understanding him. "No." Lakshmi's monkey chattered angrily as it sensed its mistress's distress. "You want to show everyone that you are a warrior, even though you saved my brother. That is not enough. You have to prove yourself again and again." Jack felt a spark of anger. "You do not know." "I know you, Jack Lark. You think you have nothing to offer the world except your sword, that your bravery is the one honest thing about you." Lakshmi nuzzled her pet, using its familiar touch to calm her. "You are mistaken. You have so much more to give, but you hide your real self away, protecting it under the shell of a fine British officer." She smiled, yet she looked so sad that it took all of Jack's willpower not to gather her into his arms. "So, you must leave. You cannot stay here and fight for my father. You must go to your countrymen. Wrap yourself up in the red coat and become the killer we expect." Lakshmi shamed him by speaking the truth. He thought of the brutality of war. A part of him loved the madness that drove him into the fight. With it, he was a killer, the kind of leader that men needed in the dreadful bloodletting of battle. Only there could he prove himself and demonstrate just what he could do. He could not do that as a courtier or as a gentleman. When war came, Jack knew he would not shirk from the fight. It was the one thing he was good at. "And if I don't go?" He tried to keep the longing from his voice. "You cannot stay. You cannot betray your homeland. It is not in you. Even if some would wish it otherwise." Jack heard the subtle promise. "Would you have me stay? Would you wear a chain like a pet?" Lakshmi wrapped a finger around the tiny gold chain on her monkey's foot. "For to some, that is all you would be." "No." "Would you fight your own kind?" "No." "Then you cannot stay." Jack nodded, accepting the truth in her words. They built a barrier between them, one that he knew he could now never cross. "Fight your battle, Jack Lark. Kill more men." Lakshmi gathered her silver sari around her slight body as if suddenly cold. "Be what you must be." "No, I forbid it. You shall not leave my service, not now, not ever." Jack forced his spine straighter. "With respect, sir, I'm not asking for your permission." The Maharajah leapt to his feet. The durbar room was empty, and the noise of his boots hitting the marbled floor echoed around the enormous chamber. "How dare you? I have given you everything. Now you stand there wearing the uniform of my general and tell me that you're leaving like it's nothing more than a bloody house party?" The Maharajah's voice rose, his anger spewing forth. Jack focused on a spot an inch above the Maharajah's eyes, which blazed with rage. He thought of the colour sergeant who had dominated his early life in the army. This rant paled in comparison. "I gave you back your life when I could have ordered you killed." The Maharajah stalked forward, his face thrust into Jack's. "Your body would be rotten now. You would be putrid, nothing more than fat maggots and bleached bones. You live because of me. You stand there because of me. Your life is mine. I decide what you do, where you go. You forfeited your right to choose when you came to me begging to be taken in." Jack lowered his eyes and met the uncompromising stare of the Maharajah. He did not flinch from the confrontation. "Sir, enough!" The Maharajah snapped the word, cutting Jack off. "I've had enough of your whining. You are in my service until either I or death release you. Do not make me choose the latter." He spun on his heel, stomping away, heading for the small door at the rear of the durbar room that led to his private apartments. "You owe me." Jack said the words softly, yet the Maharajah whirled around as if he had shouted the foulest abuse. "I owe you nothing," he screamed. His boots pounded on the floor as he strode towards Jack, his hands balling into fists. Jack didn't flinch. "I gave you your son's life. You gave me mine. We're even." He spoke firmly as the Maharajah came close. "Do not talk to me of debt. I am a king. Do not think to stand there as my equal. You are nothing but a mewling worm. I can crush you under my boot without sparing you a second thought." "That's as may be. It will not stop me leaving." "You would turn your back on me. You would fight me." The Maharajah sounded calmer. Jack looked him hard in the eye, searching his gaze for a softening in his stance. "I have no choice." The Maharajah's head seemed to sag, as if his quick rage had exhausted him. He looked at Jack, his eyes full of bitter sadness, and then he sighed. "No. None of us have a choice, not even a king. You can no more stay and fight for me than I can sit behind these walls and let you British take my country." "I cannot fight my countrymen," Jack thought of Lieutenant Fenris, "as much as I may wish it otherwise." "You will warn them if you go. They will know I'm coming." "They will know you're coming anyway. You cannot hide an army." "You can tell them of my forces, our numbers, our plans." "Does that matter? Will you fight any differently?" The Maharajah sighed. "I thought you no diplomat. Yet your bluntness seems more effective than I gave you credit for." "I am sorry, sir. For whatever that is worth, I am truly sorry. I did not want this." Jack spoke earnestly. He meant every word. The Maharajah sucked in a deep breath. He pulled himself up straight before fixing Jack with a firm stare. "You can go. Take Miss Young Summers and go back to your countrymen. But you will obey one last order for your king." Jack nodded. "Yes, sir." "Warn them." The Maharajah stood uncomfortably close. Jack could feel the warm touch of the king's breath wash over him as he was given his final order. "Tell them I'm coming with all my strength. Tell them to leave my land and save the bloodshed." Jack nodded. "I will, sir." "Will it make a difference?" The question was asked sincerely. Jack hung his head. He thought of Proudfoot and his ambition. "No." The Maharajah's stare betrayed nothing. "What will they do with you?" "I don't know." "If they are wise, they will hang you." The Maharajah snorted as he made the wry observation. For the first time a trace of a smile lit up his proud features. "You willingly give up everything you have here so you can return to the people who will likely denounce you as a thief and an impostor and string you up like a common criminal." He shook his head as if unable to understand. "I hope they do not. The world is a more interesting place with you in it, Jack Lark. Let us hope the information you bring will be enough to save you." He paused, looking around the fabulous Durbar room as if seeking inspiration. When he faced Jack again, his expression had hardened. It was a transformation Jack had seen before. The warrior king was looking at his enemy. "Go now. The debt is paid. The next time we meet, I will try to kill you." The Maharajah spun on his heel and walked away. Jack watched him go. He had done what he came for. Now he would return to his own people and deliver the Maharajah's warning. Only time would tell if it would be enough to save his neck. Chapter 29. The army assembled at dawn. They formed up in the wide maidan that separated the walls of the fortress from the splendour of the palace. Hundreds of armed men brought together by the Maharajah to carry out a lightning strike against the British cantonment at Bundapur. The cavalry occupied nearly half of the available space. At the front stood the famous blue lancers, as neat and ordered as any British regiment. Behind them were the irregular horse that made up the bulk of the Maharajah's cavalry. These were the hard men who lived in the hills of the kingdom of Sawad. They had arrived in small groups, each local chieftain leading his men to meet his ruler's summons, and were fearsomely armed with a bewildering array of weaponry, from ancient silver jezails to modern percussion muskets and carbines. All wore at least one blade, either a curving talwar like the one Jack himself carried, or a straight blade made more similar to a British heavy cavalry sword. They were a formidable force, a warlike band that could clearly relish a fight. The infantry formed up in the large blocks in which they would march towards Bundapur. At the fore stood the ordered and regimented lines of the Maharajah's guards. They were dressed for war with mail coats worn over their dark blue uniforms, their heavy talwars hanging at their hips. The sun shone on their armour, glinting from the massed ranks, adding more grandeur to the spectacle of so many assembled in one place. They looked like soldiers of old, more suited to the wars of the past, where every man fought with the brutal weapons that could hack an opponent to pieces or hammer him into bloody submission. They were the Maharajah's finest warriors, and they would fight to the death for their king. Behind the precise ranks and files of the guard stood the massed bulk of the foot soldiers. They were armed and dressed in wildly different styles, yet all bore the same warlike expression. These were the hard men from a hard country, and they would fight with as much devotion as any trained soldier. To a man they hoped for loot, for a reward more earthly than the more ethereal value of serving their overlord. They were bandits, landless men from the robber country, whose keen eyes looked for gain, their light fingers and quick wits ready to seize the opportunity to increase their store of wealth. Guardsmen walked through the ranks, issuing a blue silk armband to every man. The Maharajah's pandit had blessed each one, and now they would be worn to unite the disparate troops, adding a uniform touch to the wild men who had come to answer the Maharajah's call, forming them into a single army with a single purpose: to destroy the British cantonment at Bundapur. Jack felt cold as he sat in the saddle watching the thousands of men coming together. He was struck by the gaudy vibrancy of the scene, the lack of a single uniform creating a kaleidoscope of colour. Yet there was no doubting the unity of the men. The warlike horde knew they had been summoned to fight, and that purpose united them more forcefully than any uniform. "We will truly have to fight them," Isabel spoke in a voice laced with horror. She sat at Jack's side, her young mare quivering as it sensed its mistress's distress. Jack reached across and squeezed her hand where it rested on the pommel of her saddle. He looked at her rare beauty, savouring the vitality of her youth, very aware that he had made two choices when he had asked the Maharajah for permission to leave. At least he no longer dreaded being in the saddle, the long, difficult hours of drill with the Maharajah's lancers leaving his muscles hard and well used to the demands of controlling the powerful horse he had been given from the Maharajah's own stables. The uncompromising lessons had taught him well, and he could now ride as hard as any lancer, a skill he was certain to need in the bitter fight that was surely to come. "We will fight them if we have to. If they attack the cantonment at Bundapur, then we must do what we must." Jack's voice was cold. "They frighten me." Isabel spoke softly, a child faced with the monster from a nightmare. Jack's jaw was set firm as he ran a professional eye over the Maharajah's army. They have numbers on their side, but that's all. I'd still wager on our boys seeing them off. But we'll need to stand firm and keep them out. Butcher them with our volleys. God help us if they get close enough to fight hand to hand. Isabel shivered despite the rising heat of the morning. Sunrise was still a long way off, but already the day promised to be brutally hot. It would be an unpleasant day in the saddle, but Jack was determined they would ride for as long as they could, no matter what conditions they faced. They had been given permission to leave, but still he would take no chances. He would not rest until they were a long way away from the army that the Maharajah planned to unleash. The noise of the gathering horde suddenly increased. The cacophony of sound was deafening. There were none of the martial tones used to inspire and control the British army. In place of the strident call of the bugle and the disciplined staccato of the drum, there was an ear-splitting medley of screech and bawl, an unholy frenzy that erupted in one spontaneous roar. Jack grimaced as the sound swelled. Thousands of men were cheering, their coarse bellows underscoring the higher-pitched din. His heart pounding, he searched for the source of the unprompted raucous symphony, wondering what could have inspired such bedlam. The gates to the fortress had been flung wide open, the passageway into the heart of the citadel lined with immaculately dressed guards who snapped to attention as the shouted commands that were barely audible against the frenzy of sound. From the darkness of the gatehouse, the Maharajah emerged to address his army, and Jack watched in awe as the man he had begun to think of as a friend entered his domain with all the great panoply of a powerful ruler. The Maharajah was seated on the back of an enormous elephant. The creature's grey hide was thickly covered in silver traces that shimmered and shone as the animal emerged into the early morning sunlight that was just beginning to stream across the fortress. Its head was painted in fabulous patterns, bold crimson and scarlet swirls intertwined with gold and silver ornaments to create an intricate display. Its tiny eyes were surrounded with wide white bands, an extra pair of huge staring eyes making the beast appear like a monster from a fairy tale, a creature from another world summoned forth by the great power of the Maharajah. The Maharajah sat high in a splendid golden howdah. He was dressed in the same crimson robes he had worn when presenting Jack with the sword that he still wore at his hip. He looked every bit the magisterial ruler, the very epitome of a foreign king. Everything about him appeared almost otherworldly, as if he were a creation of divine power imbued with earthly life, a child of the gods given leave to rule mortal men. Jack heard Isabel draw in a sharp breath as she saw the cause of such frantic devotion. It was hard to equate the magnificent ruler in front of them with the man they had so often seen dressed in the simple garb of an ordinary soldier. The contrast was astonishing, and Jack could not truly believe he had once sat on the Maharajah's council, at the heart of his inner circle. The elephant walked calmly into the sunlight, beginning a long procession that would bring the Maharajah into full view of his assembled army. This was grandeur on an impressive scale, and Jack wondered if he had been right to be so confident that the British at Bundapur could withstand an assault by such a force as he was witnessing. Isabel was not the only one frightened by what they saw. "Okay, laddie. Time to get you two out of here." Jack looked down and saw Subadar Khan glaring firmly back at him. This time he intended to do exactly as he was told. The Maharajah was stirring his men into a frenzy. He stood high above them, haranguing them in their own tongue, exhorting them to be ready for battle, to take the fight to the white-faced invader who threatened to rip their land apart. Jack had never heard him talk with such powerful invective. He spoke like a man possessed, his wild gestures and bold oration in stark contrast to the mild, sophisticated man who had treated Jack and Isabel with such good humour. Jack knew then that he had made the right decision in asking to leave. "Cover your faces! Quickly now!" Subadar Khan handed over 2 of the silk bands they had been giving out to the assembling warriors. It was good advice. More than one swarthy face had started to stare in their direction. The Maharajah was urging his army to slay their new enemy, and it made no sense to present themselves as an easy target for the wrath that was building so quickly. Jack could feel the strain in the air, like the tension that built before a summer's thunderstorm. He sensed the danger, as did Subadar Khan, who beckoned to a detachment of his guards to form a protective cordon around Jack and Isabel. "Let's go." Jack bowed low in the saddle, speaking into the ear of the Subadar, who had remained close to his stirrup. The blue-uniformed guards led them away, skulking around the edge of the inner wall, doing their best to ignore the building hatred. The army began to chant, the deep, rhythmic sound coming in pulsating waves as the men responded to the call to war. It hammered into the small party as they scurried away, the noise more terrifying than any Jack had heard before, even the sound of the huge Russian columns paling in comparison. The dark gatehouse was cold after the warmth of the morning sun, the sudden chill shocking against their exposed flesh. Yet it was a relief to be away from the dreadful keening, the thick stone walls deadening the oppressive sound of the army's visceral chant. "Ride quickly, laddie! Do not stop for anything!" Subadar Khan offered the final words of advice as they passed through the immense outer gates and onto the long, twisting ramp that led down to the wide plains surrounding the fortress. Jack nodded his thanks before jabbing his spurs into the flanks of his horse. It was time to ride, to escape the refuge they had sought so willingly. The palace that had given him so much was now the heart of his enemy's strength. He had made his choice. He could not betray his country, no matter what penalties he faced. He was a redcoat, and nothing could change that. War had come, and Jack had chosen his side. The Maharajah of Sawad had become his enemy. Chapter 30. The sound of polite laughter and the chime of cut crystal were clearly audible over the chirp and buzz of the thousands of insects that had come alive as soon as the sun had set. The bungalow in front of them was ablaze with light, the shadowy forms of people flitting across the drawn curtains as they moved within. Jack turned to look at Isabel, wanting to savour the moment. He knew it would be the last time he would be able to look at her so freely. The sense of impending doom was heavy upon him, but he strode towards Proudfoot's bungalow nonetheless. He had made his choice. The journey had exhausted them. He had forced the pace, making them ride through all but the very hottest hours of the day. They had encountered no interference and seen barely a sign of another living being. Jack sensed the Maharajah's hand in their eventless journey. Whether it was to preserve Isabel's skin or to ensure the delivery of his dire warning, he was not sure, but he felt a sense of relief as they finally made it to the British cantonment at Bundapur. "Wait here, if you please, sir." Colour Sergeant Hughes spoke respectfully but firmly. The 4 redcoats he had brought with him stamped to a halt, the presence of their colour sergeant necessitating the utmost attention to their drill. Jack noticed Hughes's furrowed brow. He did not know what reaction he would get from the men he had commanded for barely more than a day. He could read little in the colour sergeant's expression, the man's demeanour as calm as it had been the first time he had met his bogus captain. He nodded his understanding, and watched as the 24th senior non-commissioned officer marched up the steps to Proudfoot's home, his bearing erect and disciplined, as if the arrival of the most wanted felon in all of Sawad was an everyday occurrence. He risked a surreptitious sniff at his armpit. He stank. The hard ride had left him reeking, his shirt and breeches stained and rank. He had decided against wearing his blue Lancer's uniform. There was no sense in reminding Proudfoot of his role in the Maharajah's army. It would only add to the man's belief that he was a traitor. So he had hidden it, bundling it up and pushing it deep under some rocks a mile from the cantonment. He still wore his talwar, the curved blade hanging at his hip, and now he reached across, running his fingers over the coarse sharkskin hilt, seeking reassurance as he prepared to welcome his fate. "Jack." Isabel whispered his name. "Everything will be all right. We are doing the right thing." Jack smiled at her reassurance. It was some indication of how much he had grown up that she now sought to support him despite her own misgivings. "Whatever happens, I don't regret my choice," he replied. "Neither do I." Isabel's face betrayed her own anxiety. He was not the only one meeting his fate that day. They had talked on the journey. He knew she faced little physical danger, her punishment likely to be nothing more than her father's ire, followed by a rapid departure for the backwaters of an English county. But disgrace and ruin were no small punishment, and Jack thought he could understand just what it was costing her. Her duty to her kin and to her countrymen had come first, even though she would be forced to pay the price for her wanton behaviour for years to come, perhaps for the rest of her life. In Proudfoot's bungalow, the sound of polite conversation froze, the shadowed room falling into silence as the tall colour sergeant interrupted the soirée to deliver his news. Jack could picture the faces as the first whiff of scandal whipped around the room. Like vultures spying a fresh corpse, the upper echelons of the cantonment's limited society would relish the occasion of Jack's disgrace. That the villain had returned to the scene of his crime was a juicy morsel that would only add to their enjoyment of the dish. Proudfoot emerged to stand at the top of the steps. He was dressed in a crimson smoking jacket, and he still held a crystal goblet of dark red wine the colour of old blood. If he was surprised to see Jack and Isabel, it did not show on his urbane features. He even managed a thin smile, the kind a gracious host reserved for an uninvited guest. "Mr. Lark, so very good of you to return. Miss Young Summers, I am delighted to see you back safely." He stood straighter as his guests pushed to the door behind him, elbows and sharp heels working furiously to secure a better view of the entertainment. Jack saw Major Dutton, his florid face flushed from the heat and from the effects of the first of the evening's sharpeners. Kingsley was there too, but he hung back, as if unwilling to be seen, or perhaps simply bored with the evening's turn of events. Jack caught a glimpse of Fenris before his face disappeared from the throng. He could only wonder at how their first meeting would turn out, but he was certain it would not be pleasant, for him at any rate. "I have sent a runner for your father, Miss Young Summers. I am sure he will be as delighted to see you as I am," Proudfoot continued, clearly relishing the chance to be the lead actor on the stage. "However, I'm afraid I doubt there is anyone here pleased to see your return, Mr. Lark." Colour Sergeant Hughes emerged from the crowd. Major Proudfoot nodded in Jack's direction, and Hughes came down the stairs to stand a yard away from him. Jack felt the shackles of his former life slip around him with all the iron-hard resolution of the manacles that he was sure awaited him. He said nothing in reply to Proudfoot, merely standing by as if he were a fascinated spectator to the events unfurling around him. The only emotion he felt was one of disappointment that his arrival had created precisely the reaction he had expected. Proudfoot, however, was clearly delighted by the turn the evening had taken, and he puffed himself up so that he would not let his audience down. "Colour Sergeant Hughes, have that man arrested and taken to the guards room. He is to be watched at all times." The dramatic words had the desired effect, and Jack could see the pleasure on Proudfoot's face as his guests welcomed his order with a gasp of gleeful horror. "Sir." Hughes stiffened to attention. Whatever the non-commissioned officer thought was well hidden behind the dignified facade of a British sergeant, the twitch of his thick moustache the sole reaction to the command to arrest a fellow redcoat. "No!" Isabel shouted the single word firmly. "Major Proudfoot, Mr. Lark saved my life. He is not a common criminal, and you must not treat him so." Proudfoot appeared genuinely taken aback by Isabel's firm denial of his orders. He turned and handed his glass to Major Dutton, who had arrived to stand at his shoulder, before carefully walking down the steps. "Miss Young Summers, I cannot begin to imagine what you have gone through. It must have been a traumatic experience for someone of your tender years." Proudfoot spoke in the oily tones of the professional diplomat. "I can only hope that the love of your father and the opportunity to rest will allow you to recover your senses." "Damn you, Proudfoot!" Isabel stamped her foot, her mouth twisting in vexation as her oath drew a sharp intake of breath from the watching crowd. "Jack came here of his own free will to warn you." Proudfoot winced at Isabel's language before turning to face Jack. "It is clear you have had some significant effect on Miss Young Summers." He chuckled at the notion before continuing. "So, you have come to warn me. That really is very magnanimous of you, given your straitened circumstances. It must be something of grave importance to risk having your neck stretched for it." He smiled at his own pun, turning to acknowledge the one or two men in the audience who chuckled at his wordplay. Jack watched Proudfoot closely. He could see the delight in the Major's sparkling eyes. It would feel good to puncture his conceit. "The Maharajah of Sawad has gathered his forces. He plans to attack Bundapur. As of yesterday, you are at war." Jack spoke softly, lowering his voice so his announcement did not carry to the watching crowd. Proudfoot absorbed the news without a twitch. The silence drew out, the official not even deigning to reply. His guests had spilled out onto the wide veranda that surrounded his bungalow, and now they pressed forward, anxious to listen to the hushed exchange taking place between the cantonment's commander and the charlatan who had been the topic of nearly every whispered conversation for weeks in the news-starved community. Then Proudfoot began to laugh. There was no shred of enjoyment in the dry, humourless sound. It was the noise of a man suddenly realising he had managed to carry off an outrageous bluff at cards. "You are not surprised?" Jack managed to keep the disappointment from his voice. He had staked his life on the news, hoping that the warning would keep him from the scaffold. "Surprised? Why on earth would I be surprised?" Proudfoot spun on the spot, suddenly unable to stand still as he savoured the news. "Why? It is exactly as I planned." He spoke quietly so the audience on the veranda could not hear his words, but the triumph in his voice was unmistakable. Jack looked at Isabel. Her expression betrayed her distress at the officials' reaction to the news they had ridden so hard and so far to deliver. "You planned this?" Her face was white as he spoke. "Of course." Proudfoot was all scorn now. "Why else would I give the damn man the news that his kingdom will lapse when he dies? I wanted him to react." "Why?" Jack asked a question, yet he already knew the answer. His stomach churned as the full scale of Proudfoot's ambition became clear, the sour taste of having been fooled bitter in his mouth. "Because only then can I crush him." Proudfoot's voice was dispassionate as he discussed the death of hundreds of men. "How else was I to draw the sting of this damned viper? I have not long left here, and I simply have to get this done before I go. One has to think of one's career. How can I compete with Nicholson and the rest if I fail to deliver this pathetic little place?" "You bastard!" Jack hissed the words, stunned at the man's ruthlessness. "I shall take that as a compliment, coming from you." Proudfoot's voice was cold. He turned to the colour sergeant. "Bring me this villain's sword and have him put in manacles." He offered Jack a mocking bow. "Welcome home, Mr. Lark." There was nothing more to be said. Even Isabel was stunned to silence. Neither offered a word of protest as Jack was turned and led away by the four-man escort brought to ensure he did not escape for a second time. Jack and Isabel had ridden hard to warn their countrymen of the impending attack. Yet it had been Proudfoot's plan all along to drive the Maharajah to war. Hundreds would now die, sacrificed to a single man's ambition. Jack sat alone in the darkness. The guardroom had a single cell set aside for detaining errant redcoats. It was windowless and boasted nothing more than a simple cot with a straw mattress, a single thin blanket, and a rusty piss-pot. The floorboards were stained and scuffed, whilst the once white walls were scarred with the markings of the dozens of men who had picked and scraped at them to leave some evidence of their passing. It was hard not to notice the contrast with the gilded cage he and Isabel had been shown to when they threw themselves on the Maharajah's mercy. But at least there was no pretense here, and it was certainly an improvement on the storeroom prison used by the bandits. Jack grunted as he considered his fate. He was heartily sick of being held captive, but he was beginning to suspect he would be seeing the inside of many more prison cells in the coming months. For any hopes of reprieve had been cruelly dashed. His naive assumption that by delivering warning of the Maharajah's attack he might somehow be forgiven his crimes now proven to have been utterly false. He had been wrong to think that warning the British would save him, just as he had been wrong to think that serving the Maharajah would offer him a new life. Yet, as much as he regretted his fate, he could not see how he could have stayed with the Maharajah. He tried to picture riding at the head of the blue-coated lancers against the red-coated soldiers of the Queen. It was an impossible notion. Lakshmi had been right. For better or worse, he was a redcoat. He had done what his conscience dictated, and now he would have to wait and see what penalty he would pay for staying loyal to the country of his birth. He heard footsteps outside his cell, the heavy tread of more than one man loud on the hard wooden floor beyond the locked door. He couldn't make out what was said, the low voices speaking too quietly for their words to penetrate the thick door. He rose to his feet as he heard the key turn in the lock, his heart pounding a little faster as the door opened, revealing the face of the man who had come to disturb his peace. "Hello, Lark." The voice was laced with derision, the haughty upper-class drawl relishing Jack's incarceration. The door was closed, quietly, and the two burly redcoats who had followed the man into the room took up station either side of Jack. None of the men were armed, but Jack sensed that violence had crept in along with the three red-coated soldiers. The two at his sides took a firm grip on his arms, their fingers digging into his flesh, forcing him to stand facing the officer who had ordered them into position. With his arms held, he could not protect himself, and the fist came at him fast, driven by weeks of loathing. It smashed into his undefended face. The explosion of agony drove into his skull, the pain flashing white-hot across his vision. He felt the blood gush from his nose, the heat of it warm on his lips. Lieutenant Arthur Fenris stood back, blood smeared thickly over the white of his knuckles, a sneer of satisfaction on his thin face. "Welcome home, you bastard." He spat the words as he lashed out again, both fists flailing hard at Jack's body. He kept on punching long after Jack had been beaten senseless, his hatred leaving no room for mercy. Chapter 31. "Gentlemen, your attention, please." Major Proudfoot looked around the room. He had gathered his officers in his bungalow, seating them around the dining table, which had been hastily cleared of the detritus of that evening's entertainment. The cut-glass crystal and phalanxes of wine bottles had been replaced with charts and ledgers as the officers began to plan the defence of Bundapur. He looked at each officer in turn, fixing them with a piercing stare. Major Dutton's face might have been flushed scarlet from the bottle of claret that he had consumed to dull the boredom of another suffocating evening, but his eyes were sharp. The most senior of Dutton's three lieutenants, a garrulous Scotsman named Campbell, met Proudfoot's gaze with calm confidence. The youngest of the subalterns, Lieutenant Gartrey, a ginger-haired 19-year-old whose clergyman father had still not forgiven his only son for refusing to join the church, looked nervous, his tongue flickering over his cherry-red lips in short, darting movements. He failed to meet Proudfoot's stare, his eyes downcast as if that would somehow save him from saying anything. The last of Dutton's lieutenants, Lieutenant Spencer, a tall, grave man who looked more suited to the sombre trade of an undertaker than the violent world of being a soldier, gazed down on the preparations like an ancient vulture, wondering if it could raise the strength to join in a squabble over a rotting carcass. Yet at least he appeared to be giving the discussion his full attention, unlike Captain Kingsley, who stood and walked away, preferring to concentrate on filling his glass with more of the Major's port, rather than contribute to whatever plan his fellow officers were concocting. "As you now know, we face a perilous few days." Proudfoot spoke in an earnest tone, only the slightest furrow in his brow revealing his annoyance at Kingsley's lack of attention. "It is time to show that blackguard of a Maharajah that he cannot stand against Her Majesty's authority. He must be brought to heel, and I am relying on you to do it. Dutton, what say you?" "A fortress." Major Dutton began to outline his proposal in the clipped, controlled tones of a man sure of his strategy. "We build a defensive wall here. The 24th Barrack can form the right flank, with the storerooms as a strong point on the south-east corner." He thrust a podgy finger at the corner of his scribbled pencil drawing, smudging the thin line that denoted the western wall of his fortress in the process. "That gives us a field of fire here and here." Again the thick finger poked at the paper, leaving behind more sweaty fingerprints. "And strong points here and here." The look on his fellow officers' faces revealed both their understanding and their approval of the plan. Dutton commanded 3 companies of the 12th Bengal Native Infantry, each led by one of his lieutenants. All were young, ambitious men who had purchased a commission in the East India Company as a means of securing what they hoped would be a glittering and financially rewarding future. Each was the sole white officer in their company. Their subalterns were all native men of long experience who had worked their way through the ranks, earning each promotion through long and blemish-free service. None had been asked to attend the officers' conference. "Write it up, Gartry. There's a good fellow." Dutton gave the order as he finished explaining his outline for the defence of the cantonment. The younger officer looked relieved to have been given such an undemanding role, and he pulled over some blank paper so he could begin a neater version of Dutton's plan. Dutton nodded in approval. He looked at his 3rd subaltern, who had so far remained silent. "Lieutenant Spencer, begin listing the provisions we will need to bring into the fortress." "Very good, sir." The grey-faced lieutenant picked up a bottle of ink and a steel pen, his face still as neutral as it had been when Dutton first announced that the cantonment was about to be attacked. "Kingsley?" Dutton sought to bring the commander of the 24th Single Company into the discussion. "How would you suggest we dispose our forces?" Kingsley walked slowly towards the table, contemplating the last remnants of port in his tiny glass. "What's that you say, Dutton?" "Our forces." Dutton made little effort to contain the tetchy note in his reply. As ever, Kingsley's supercilious demeanour nettled the Major. He had only been in the cantonment for a short time, but he had made it clear from the start that he looked down on the 4 officers who held commissions granted by the East India Company rather than by the Queen. Dutton had done his best to be open and welcoming, but his patience was wearing thin. "How would you suggest we deploy the men?" Kingsley drained his glass and moved forward to peer at Dutton's scribbled map. "The 24th will hold the barracks. I suggest your men hold the rest of the perimeter, if you can." Dutton spluttered at the captain's choice of words. "What the devil do you mean, if we can?" Kingsley sneered disdainfully. "I doubt your damn sepoys will stand. My men will hold the strong points, and I would suggest you stay close enough to make a dash for our ranks when your fellows bolt. You, Spencer, or whatever your damn name is." Kingsley fluttered a finger in the lieutenant's direction. "Make sure the ammunition and spare muskets are in my men's barracks. The last thing we need is to be left without enough damn cartridges." Dutton snapped his pencil as he struggled to contain his rage. "How dare you, Kingsley? My men will stand and fight, goddammit! I bet my very life on it." "Well then." Kingsley didn't bat an eyelid at the Major's angry display. "I rather fancy you'll get your chance to do just that pretty soon. Don't you?" "Gentlemen, please." Major Proudfoot had left his officers, moving to sit in a fine leather wing-backed armchair facing away from the table. He spoke in the mild tones of a gentleman in his club ordering a peg and soda. "We cannot waste time arguing amongst ourselves." Dutton looked like he was about to explode. "That damn man made a very serious accusation. I'll not stand by and let him insult my command. Dutton, please." Proudfoot crossed his legs as he spoke, folding his hands into his lap. "Your idea of establishing a fortress is a fine one. But do you not think it a little tame?" "Tame?" "Well, I rather think it looks as though we're skulking away. Don't you agree?" "Do you have a better idea?" Dutton threw the remnants of his snapped pencil onto the table, his temper threatening to bubble over. Proudfoot formed his fingers into a steeple, holding them to his lips as if mulling over the problem. The officers waited with growing impatience for his answer, his enigmatic silence picking at their already thinly stretched nerves. The door opened, breaking the silence. Lieutenant Fenris walked into the room. His right hand was heavily bandaged, the dull red stain of blood a dark shadow against the clean white of the dressing. "I say, I'm sorry I'm late. I had a little business to attend to. Did I miss anything?" Proudfoot smiled indulgently at the junior officer's nonchalant confidence. "The Maharajah is going to attack us, Arthur. We are planning our defence." Fenris smiled at the announcement, clearly not shocked by the revelation. "Well, that's a jolly good show. It's about time we brought the bugger to his knees. So, what's the plan?" The officers looked at each other, the tension obvious in the glare Dutton shot towards Captain Kingsley. "There is some debate on the matter." Proudfoot offered the bland explanation with a humourless smile. "Would you care to venture an opinion?" "Well, it's damn simple, isn't it?" Fenris helped himself to a glass of port from the open bottle left on a side table. "Beat the buggers black and blue and send them scurrying away with their tail between their bloody legs." "In open battle or in a defensive stand here at the cantonment?" Proudfoot inquired reasonably. "What? In the open, of course." Fenris held his hand to his head in a dramatic gesture of understanding. "Dutton wants to stay here, don't you, old boy?" "I think that would be the sensible course of action, yes." Dutton bristled at the young officer's theatricals. "Of course you do. Much safer." Fenris smiled thinly. "But that's all a bit dull. Sitting here blasting away from behind a wall won't make good reading, will it? I say we fight them properly, like the old Duke would have done. Engage them in battle and beat the living daylights out of the impudent buggers." Kingsley walked to his subaltern's side, snatching away the bottle of port that the younger officer was threatening to empty all on his own. "Fenris is right. We should fight them in the open. There is no need to hide away from a bunch of bloody bandits. We find them, we fire a few volleys, and they run for their sorry lives. It really is awfully simple." Proudfoot smiled wolfishly at the advice. "You are a man after my own heart, Kingsley. Indeed you are." He rose athletically to his feet, as if suddenly revitalized by the new plan. "That does sound somewhat grander, don't you think, Dutton?" Dutton opened his mouth to snap back an answer before thinking better of it, biting off his angry words before they were said. He looked down and studied the table, using the distraction to compose himself. When he turned to face Proudfoot once again, his expression was calmer. "The Maharajah has more than 2,000 men." He spoke quietly. "Most of those are mounted cavalry, but even his infantry outnumber us many times over. If we venture into open country, we will make their task easier, and ours a damn sight more difficult. We have neither cavalry to protect our flanks, nor cannon to engage them at a distance. It would be a close-run affair." Kingsley snorted, his opinion of Dutton's analysis clear. He walked across the room, taking the port with him, refilling his glass as he walked and downing the heavy fortified wine in a single mouthful. Proudfoot was more vocal in his condemnation. "Major Dutton, I have lost count of the times you have told anyone who cared to listen that the Maharajah's forces amount to nothing. Why such timidity now?" Dutton cleared his throat before dodging the question. "It is my professional opinion that we must fight a defensive action. To engage such superior numbers in the open is foolhardy." Proudfoot nodded wisely before adopting a more formal tone. Thank you for your advice, Major. He turned and addressed the captain of the 24th Foot, who had refilled his glass and now sipped more cautiously at the contents. Captain Kingsley, you have heard Major Dutton's conclusion. What say you? My opinion hasn't changed. Fight them in the open and get the damn thing over with. That rabble will soon run when the lead starts to fly. He turned and sneered sarcastically at Dutton. I bet my life on it. Proudfoot nodded again. I'm of a mind to agree with you, Captain Kingsley. His grave expression did not sit well with the gleam of triumph in his eyes. My decision is made. We will fight the Maharajah in the open. Build your fortress, Dutton, if it makes you feel any better. We will need somewhere to corral the women and the sick. You can leave half a company here as a reserve, but we shall fight like British soldiers, not some bloody Frenchmen. He glared at Dutton, daring him to continue to argue. Dutton swallowed hard as he was overruled. Very well, sir. I shall see that my men are ready to march. Proudfoot was clearly delighted to have won the battle of wills so easily. Thank you. Yet the commander of the 12th was not quite finished. What of the impostor, Lark? Proudfoot's face creased into a scowl. What of him? Where is he to be during the action? Move him into the storerooms. He can rot there for all I care. Dutton reached forward, taking the two halves of the broken pencil, holding them carefully together as if trying to repair the damage. I would have thought that was a waste. A waste? Fenris interrupted before Proudfoot could reply. The man will hang. Who cares where the bastard goes? I do. Dutton's eyes flashed in anger as he sought to enforce his will over his superior. He is the only man here to have seen the Maharajah's forces up close, and the only man who has actually been involved in some action. Only if you believe that cock and bull story he concocted, Fenris snapped his reply. Proudfoot lifted a hand, silencing the junior officer. Hush, Arthur. Go on, Dutton. Whether or not you believe his story, he is still the only man to have seen the enemy. He is too valuable to be ignored. Proudfoot scowled as he thought on Dutton's words. You are right. Speak to him, Dutton. See what he knows. And what can I offer him? Dutton smiled, but with no warmth. Why should he help us? He knows he is to hang. Proudfoot nodded. He paced across the room, clearly deep in thought, before slumping back into his favourite armchair. You are quite right, Dutton. Lark could be a valuable asset. It would be foolish for us to dismiss him out of hand. He pondered the matter further before smiling as he found a solution to his liking. Offer to let him fight. The man is supposed to be a redcoat after all. Let him ply his trade in his true rank. Who knows, if he proves himself in battle, perhaps it will go well for him. If he falls, well, no one is going to lament the passing of a damned villain. Proudfoot arched his eyebrow at Lieutenant Fenris to make sure he had got the message, before picking up the most recently arrived copy of the Times, which had been neatly folded and left on the small drum table near his chair. If he agrees to provide the information, then he can join the 24th. Dutton nodded, glad to have secured one victory, albeit a small one. He returned to the sketch of the fortress, oblivious to the look of delight on Fenris's face, as he understood his commander's pointed comment. The commander of the British forces had made his decision. Chapter 32. Up you get, sir." Jack obeyed the corporal's order as quickly as his abused body would allow. He had been lying on the lumpy mattress in misery, battling with the pain and wondering how long he would be left there. The interruption had come as something of a relief. "What's going on?" He sucked air through his teeth as his body protested at being moved. He recognised Corporal Jones from his one day spent with the company, the soldier's Welsh accent a welcome touch of something familiar. "Sorry, sir. I ain't allowed to talk to you." Jones offered a smile before he ignored his orders and gave Jack some explanation. "The Ruperts want you, sir. I don't know any more than that. I'm to let you clean yourself up and then take you up to Major Dutton's office." Jones clearly felt safer calling him sir, and Jack did not have the strength to tell him that the title no longer applied. "Do you know why?" He was curious despite his pain. "No idea, sir. But then who knows what goes on in the head of a bloody officer?" The corporal chuckled as if struck by an odd notion. "Except you might, I reckon." Jack tried to smile. He felt the stirring of hope. He might be a villain, but if the corporal was indicative of his fellows, it appeared the redcoats bore him no ill will. Now he had been summoned, and anything was preferable to lying alone in the gloom, so he let himself be led out of the room and into the darkness that had smothered the cantonment now that the sun had long set. "Mr. Lark, sit down." Dutton rose to his feet as Jack was ushered into the room. It was close to 1 a.m, but the Major was still keen-eyed and looked workmanlike in his shirt sleeves. Jack took the chair opposite, wincing as he lowered himself carefully down, and waited to see why he had been summoned in the middle of the night. The Major chewed on his lip as he considered him. "Good God! What happened to you?" "I fell down some stairs." Dutton snorted. "What bloody stairs?" He shook his head. "Fenris?" Jack nodded. "The blackguard. Well, it won't happen again. I'll see to that." Jack didn't care to acknowledge the promise. He eased himself into as comfortable a position as he could and waited for Dutton to speak. Dutton returned his attention to his paperwork, leaving Jack to sit in uncomfortable silence. Several minutes passed before the Major finally shoved the papers to one side and looked at him. "It doesn't feel right, calling you Lark." Dutton's manner was bluff. It was clear he was uncomfortable, as though he was not sure how he should deal with an impostor. Jack was in no mood to make the Major's life easier, so he simply sat in silence, returning the scrutinizing glare with calm indifference. Dutton's office was cramped, and Jack's head bumped against the wall behind him. The narrow desk had plainly been in use for decades, its pock-marked surface betraying its long service to the East India Company. The contrast with the magisterial splendour of Proudfoot's rooms was not lost on him. Dutton frowned at Jack's silence. "You look damn composed for a man facing a dance on the bloody scaffold." "I'm not on it yet." Dutton guffawed at the glib reply. "You are a brave fellow, Jack. I knew it as soon as I clapped eyes on you. But this imposter business took me by surprise, that did. I would never have thought you were a damned charlatan." "None of you did. Not even Proudfoot." "Indeed." Dutton shook his head as if clearing away an unpleasant memory. "It's nice to see that damn man make a mistake. He may turn out to be human after all." He looked at Jack warily under a furrowed brow, suddenly cautious about revealing his true feelings towards his superior officer. Jack didn't bat an eyelid. It was no surprise that Dutton and Proudfoot did not see eye to eye. "Why am I here, Dutton?" "To business, then." Dutton seemed relieved. "I want to know everything about the Maharajah and his army. Numbers, weapons, Everything. So now I am to be treated as a spy. Jack sensed the irony of his new role. The Maharajah's vizier may have been right, after all. Yes, if you like. The Maharajah is going to attack. You told us that much already. Now I need details. I want to know who I am going to meet in battle. No. Jack spoke the denial quietly, yet there was no mistaking the force in the word. He had hoped that the warning about the Maharajah's impending attack would save him. Proudfoot's reaction had made it clear he had been wrong. He saw no point in offering what little information he possessed without receiving anything in return. Dutton plainly wanted it, so Jack would wait to see what bargain could be struck. Dutton chewed on his moustache for a moment before he spoke. I knew you would say that. I told Proudfoot the very same. He has already allowed me to offer you a deal. A deal? Tell us all you know, and you'll be rewarded. Jack snorted. Bollocks. Dutton grinned at Jack's forthright phrase. You'll be allowed to fight. I can't see Proudfoot trusting me with a bandook. What's to stop me shooting the bastard between the eyes the moment I get the chance? You will be given a weapon, Jack. You'll be allowed to fight with the 24th. You can help us beat the Maharajah. How the hell is that supposed to work? You would be a redcoat. You'd fight in the ranks. Jack understood immediately. And likely spare you all the shame of a court-martial. It would be more convenient if I died in the battle, wouldn't it just? No messy trial, no unpleasantness, just an unmarked grave and bang, there you go. No imposter, no scandal. If I were in your shoes, I'd jump at the offer. I'd rather take my chances in battle than face being strung up like a common thief. So, you're doing me a favour. Like I already said, bollocks. Dutton sat back in his chair. Help us, Jack. Help you? I'm a bloody villain. Why would you need my help? Dutton rubbed a hand across his face, as if trying to wipe away the exhaustion. Because we need you. He sounded drained as he confessed the true situation. Proudfoot and his lapdog Fenris have decided we are to fight the Maharajah in the open. That damned fool Kingsley agrees. They want some grand battle. The fucking fools. Jack shook his head in disbelief. Proudfoot is already composing the dispatch he'll be able to send the governor. He wants a glorious victory. And it's up to us to give it to them. They think it will be easy. Kingsley believes the Maharajah and his men will take one look at us standing in line and run for the bloody hills. Never. He's coming for blood. He won't run. I know. Which is why I need your help. We need every mother's son who is fit to fight if we're to stand a chance. My lieutenants are already arming every bloody cook and bottle washer in this damn place. Help me, Jack. Jack heard the pleading tone. He'd given up his place in the Maharajah's court to return to his countrymen. Could he really sit by and watch them be destroyed? What happens to me after the battle? After the battle? Dutton snorted. Who knows what will happen to any of us? The Maharajah has over 2,000 men. I'm not so bloody sure we can think about after the battle. Jack nodded at the honest reply. It was clear what he had to do. He had chosen his side. He would tell Dutton everything he knew and then take his place in the battle line and fight as an ordinary soldier in an effort to snatch victory from the face of certain defeat. He was a redcoat. It was all he knew. They marched well before dawn. The 4 companies formed one long column that snaked through the cantonment before turning east. The 24th Foot led the way, with Dutton's 3 companies from the 12th Bengal Native Infantry forced to march in the cloud of dust kicked up by their heavy boots. There was no fanfare to announce their departure, only the martial call of the bugle and the rhythmic beat of the drum driving them forward. The redcoats sang as they marched, their deep voices lifting as they bellowed out the 24th's regimental march, the Warwickshire Lad. They might not have been good as a choir as Reverend Youngsummers would have hoped for, but they sang with vigour, if not with harmony. Ye Warwickshire lads and ye lasses, see what at our jubilee passes. Come revel away, rejoice, and be glad, for the lad of all lads was a Warwickshire lad, and the lad was a Warwickshire lad. Warwickshire lad, all be glad, for the lad of all lads was a Warwickshire lad. They had no colours to lead them. The pride of the battalion was back with the bulk of the regiment far away in the Punjab. They had only their officers to inspire them, their sergeants and corporals to rally them. Fewer than 400 redcoats marched to do battle with the Maharajah's army of more than 2,000. Chapter 33. The redcoats waited patiently in line, standing at ease now that they had been ordered to a halt. Colour Sergeant Hughes was on the far left of the line, so the redcoats who stood in the centre files could mutter to one another in low voices without being detected. The march had been short, but it had become increasingly wearing as the column marched and countermarched, often retracing its own tracks as the commanders fussed about the position of their troops. They had finally settled on the current position just after the sun had begun to rise, the redcoats belatedly ordered into the 2-man deep line in which they would be expected to fight. Jack approved of the officer's choice of battlefield. The redcoats' line stretched across a valley, its flanks securely tethered against sharply rising ground to either side. The ground to the front was open, with the well-worn path that led to Bundapur meandering through the centre. It gave the thin red line a good field of fire, the Maharajah's army forced to advance along the narrowing valley if they wanted to bring the smaller British force to battle. The steep sides acted like a funnel, compressing any attacking force whilst denying the opportunity for any enemy cavalry to manoeuvre around the redcoats' flanks. Dutton and Kingsley might not have agreed on how to fight, but they had at least chosen good ground. The cantonment was around half a mile to the southwest, with the walls of the city of Bundapur a similar distance to the west. Once out of the valley, the ground opened to a wide plain, and Jack offered a silent prayer that the redcoats would be able to turn back the enemy tide without the need to retreat. Any withdrawal into the open ground would be fraught with danger. If the redcoats were forced to retreat, they faced destruction, the wide open space the perfect killing ground for the vast numbers of enemy cavalry. Dutton had got his wish. A makeshift company had been formed from the many supernumeraries in the cantonment. These rough and ready soldiers stood guard behind the walls of the temporary fortress Dutton's sepoys had constructed around the 24th's barracks. The storerooms had been packed with ammunition, and the cantonment's few women and children were safe in the barrack buildings. Dutton had planned for disaster with the same meticulous care that Proudfoot was putting into the preparation of his victory dispatch. Jack wondered how Isabel would be coping with being confined. He knew she would rather have been allowed to ride with the fighting column, and it brought a smile to his face as he imagined her arguing with Proudfoot when she had been ordered to remain behind. The thought of Isabel sent a spark of anger through Jack's soul. They had both paid a high price for remaining loyal to the country of their birth. He pushed the rage down, storing it deep inside, searching for the patience he would need. He had witnessed the destructive power of battle before. Nothing was certain once the violent struggle began, and anything was possible in the chaos that would follow. He would have to bide his time and wait. My eye, would you look at that? Kingsley looks like he needs a good shit. Jack kept his expression neutral as the man in the file next to him offered his judgment on the company's new commander. Unaware of the acidic remark, Captain Kingsley slid from the saddle of his grey mare and took up the proper position for a company commander on the right of the Redcoats' line. I'm sure Fenris would offer to wipe his fucking ass for him. Corporal Jones, in charge of that section of the Redcoats, added his own ribald observation. Jack smiled. He found nothing odd in the men being so vocal in their criticism of their officer. Redcoats would always grumble the moment they got the chance, just as they would fight with vicious determination when their officers removed the leash and sent them at the enemy. "So, what do we call you now we aren't supposed to call you sir?" The soldier to Jack's left nudged his arm, interrupting his thoughts. His sing-song accent reminded Jack of a Welshman who had fought in his company at the Alma. "Jack. My name's Jack." The Welsh soldier clicked his tongue. "We can't call you that, boyo. There's already a Jack in the company. That bloody Englishman over there." He nodded in the direction of a ferret-faced man on the right side of the company. "There's too many bloody Englishmen around here, if you ask me." Corporal Jones chuckled as he offered the barbed comment. Jack smiled, enjoying the banter. The transformation in Jones was fascinating. Around officers he had been ill at ease. Now back in the ranks, he was clearly one of the company's most popular non-commissioned officers, enjoying a warm rapport with the men under his command. Corporal Jones never forgave his sister for marrying a boy from Bath. Jack's new friend winked as he spoke confidingly. "Isn't that right, Corp?" "You talk too much, Jenkins." The redcoat was not put out by his corporal's instruction to be quiet. "So, what did your mates call you before you went and started impersonating a bloody Rupert?" He was several inches shorter than Jack, as were most of the men in the company, with the pinched face that came from a childhood of hard work and not enough food. Yet he had an open smile, and Jack was drawn to his good humour. "Mud. They called me Mud." It felt like a lifetime since he had heard the nickname, an obvious reference to the mudlarks who tried to eke out a living picking at the detritus that flowed down the River Thames. Jenkins chuckled. "So, you're a bleeding Londoner." He leant forward so he could peer along the line. "Hey, Brown, we got one of your lot here." Jack saw another redcoat lean forward to join the conversation. His face creased into a scowl. "Keep your voice down, you dozy Welshman." Brown shook his head at the foolishness of his fellow redcoat. He fixed Jack with a rueful grin. "Most of this bloody company's from up north, apart from those two Welsh chumps. Us Londoners need to stick together. So, where you from?" "Whitechapel. You?" "Bow. Right shithole it was." "Private Brown, silence in the ranks or you'll be on a charge." Colour Sergeant Hughes stamped down on the idle conversation, his fierce glare settling on the last redcoat to speak. Brown pulled his head back, but not before flashing Jenkins a filthy look. Jack smiled at the exchange. It felt good to be back in the company of other soldiers. The redcoat he had been given might not have been tailored to fit, nor was it made of the same fine scarlet weave as an officer's uniform, but it didn't come weighted with responsibility, the burden of command that accompanied the golden buttons and bullion epaulets. For once it was a relief to simply march in the ranks, following the directions of the officers and the sergeants. "Company! Company, attention!" Colour Sergeant Hughes called his men to readiness. A handful of Proudfoot's vedettes were returning to the thin red line, their horses lathered in sweat from being ridden hard in the early morning heat. They made straight for the gaggle of officers in the centre. The 24th were the rightmost company in the line, with the 3 companies from the 12th Bengal Native Infantry arranged in order to their left. Dutton and Major Proudfoot stood in the middle of the 4 companies, with a handful of mounted native troopers waiting patiently behind them, ready to act as scouts or to deliver orders to the company commanders. Proudfoot had insisted that Lieutenant Fenris also remained mounted, and he had been ordered to stay at the political officer's side. His subaltern's abrupt promotion to aide-de-camp went some way to explain Captain Kingsley's peevish expression. "Company! Company, prepare to load!" Colour Sergeant Hughes delivered the order with the clipped precision learnt in 2 decades of soldiering. "Load!" The Redcoats had stiffened to attention the moment they had heard their senior non-commissioned officer draw breath. With the final bellowed command still echoing around the confined valley, they began the process of loading their muskets. Jack followed their lead without hesitation, his movements instinctive. In unison with the rest of the company, he extracted a fresh cartridge from the pouch at his waist, lifting it to his lips. He bit off the bullet, the bitter, acrid taste of gunpowder just as he remembered, then spat the heavy metal ball into the barrel of his musket, following the procedure he had learnt through hours of repetitive practice. It had been many months since he had loaded a musket, but the memory came back without conscious thought, the drill buried deep into his very being. With their weapons loaded and primed, the Redcoats were ready to fight. They stared down the valley, looking away to the south, waiting for the first sight of the enemy, waiting for battle. Around Jack, the men fidgeted and worried, fiddling with their kit or picking at their uniforms. It was the time for fear to build and for nerves to be stretched thin. Jack remembered the feelings he had endured the night before the battle at the Alma River, the tension that had gnawed deep in his guts, the terror that had built, so that when the Redcoats stormed the Russians' redoubt, he had been screaming his horror aloud. Somehow he had contained his fear. In its place had been the dreadful rage that had driven him in a mad assault on the Russian columns. After the battle he had been terrified by what he had done. Yet alongside that emotion he felt pride at what had been unleashed, a sordid joy that he had buried deep in his corroded soul. Only the Maharajah's daughter had spied his rotten core. Lakshmi had told Jack that he hid his real self away, and she had been quite correct. To reveal his true nature would be to inspire repugnance, for only in the horror of battle could Jack show his true worth. Chapter 34. The Redcoats heard the enemy long before they could be seen. The Maharajah's army advanced with raucous grandeur, the loud trumpeting and the crash of drums reaching the straining ears of the 400 soldiers who waited in silence for them to arrive. Then the horde appeared. The Redcoats stared at the enemy force as it swarmed into view, the dust kicked up by the hooves of the horses billowing down the valley to sting their eyes. There was no fanfare, the British drummers and buglers remaining silent, greeting the Maharajah's host in the timeless manner of the Redcoats, silent and stoical no matter what the provocation. Horseman after horseman arrived, smothering the far end of the valley. Rank followed rank, the mounted warriors gathering, easing their tired horses to a stop as they spied the thin red line across their path. The sun flashed from thousands of pieces of armour and naked steel as the enemy pulled talwars from scabbards and prepared for the battle that was sure to come. The Redcoats watched, wide-eyed, as the enemy kept growing. "Fuck me," Jenkins spoke in an awestruck tone. "There's hundreds of 'em." Jack saw the ghostly white pallor on the man's face. "That's just their cavalry. We haven't seen their infantry yet." "Well, that's just lovely, isn't it now? I'm glad you're with us, Mud. I wouldn't want to have fought these buggers without knowing how many more of them are to come." The men around Jack chuckled, seizing on the weak jest to help force down their emotions. For fear fluttered in every man's belly as the enemy horde swelled. The minutes stretched on. The redcoats forced to stand in impotent silence as the enemy gathered its strength. The leading horsemen were the warriors from the hills, the irregular troops that had assembled at their overlord's command. There was no sign of the blue-coated lancers or any of the beautifully uniformed guardsmen that formed the elite of the Maharajah's forces. Yet there were still enough men to outnumber the British by over 2-1. As the red-coated ranks stood baking in the increasing heat, the enemy cavalry studied the British line with wolfish fascination, sensing its fragility, the puny number of foot soldiers surely unable to withstand the power of the massed horsemen. They imagined an easy victory. If the thin red line were broken, then the way to the cantonment would be open. The bravest riders would have first pickings, the right to ransack the homes of the white-faced foreigners falling to those daring to be in the leading ranks of the attackers. The horsemen looked at the British line and thought of plunder. "Look you! Look at that!" Corporal Jones called for his mate's attention as a lone horseman left the throng and rode steadily towards them. Jack, like most of the redcoats around him, had been lost in his own thoughts. It had been a long night with little sleep as he provided Major Dutton with all the details of the Maharajah's army. His body still ached from the beating Fenris had delivered, but the long wait in the harsh sun had dulled his senses so that he stood as if in a trance, awake yet far away, lost in a world of painful memories. The lone rider pulled up 100 yards clear of the massed ranks of horsemen. He stood tall in his stirrups and raised his arms. In his left hand he held his naked tulwar, the blade flashing bright in the sun. In his right he held a carbine that he shook in the air as he began to shout. The redcoats were too far away to make out the words, but the message was clear. The rider was taunting the British soldiers, insulting their manhood and rousing his fellow warriors to action. He punched his weapons into the air as he challenged the British, daring them to react. "Steady in the ranks!" Colour Sergeant Hughes began to prowl behind the 24th's part of the line. His voice was calm, a balm to the fears of his soldiers who were forced to endure the enemy soldiers' display in silence. Still the tension rippled through the tight ranks, the pressure building round them as they tasted the threats of violence in the dry, arid air. More horsemen rode forward to join the first, pulling up alongside him and raising their own voices in a deep, visceral chant. The sound echoed down the valley, building steadily as other men came to join them, washing over the thin red line. Yet more riders made their way forwards, swelling the lead rank, filling the width of the valley. Along the line, the redcoats felt fear surge into their bellies, the icy rush of terror as they realised that the enemy was preparing to attack. Major Dutton spurred his horse forward, then turned it around carefully, as if aligning himself on a marker. "Men!" His voice was firm as he called for attention. "The enemy is near. It is time for us to defend our homes and the honour of our Queen. I expect you all to do your duty. Stand firm and shoot straight. Together we will be victorious. Together we will make our country proud." He looked along the line, his florid face flushed crimson with exertion. Satisfied with his speech, he nudged his horse back into the line, easing it around so that he once again stood alongside Major Proudfoot. "What a fucking idiot!" Jenkins gave his judgment on the call to arms. "Together, my arse! First sign of trouble and I bet that fathead will be galloping back to the cantonment. I know I would if only those bastards would let me have a bloody horse." Jack chuckled at the damning verdict. He was glad he was not Jenkins's officer. Then the chanting stopped, and with a final deep-throated cheer, the mass of cavalry lurched into motion. The battle for Bundapur had begun. At 100 yards, volley fire." Major Dutton shouted the command that was immediately picked up by the officers along the line. The effects of the volley would be dreadful. 400 balls of lead would be spat at the charging horsemen, the leading riders and their mounts would be gutted, the massed volley capable of butchering the head of the enemy attack. Those struck down would immediately create a bloody obstacle that would disrupt anyone still trying to press home the charge. The single massive blow would spread chaos amongst the attackers with the same wanton cruelty as it would spread death. The volley had to be timed to perfection. Fired too soon and it would lose most of its effect. The muskets were useless at much over 100 yards. Dutton would have to let the enemy close on the line if he wanted the volley to destroy the leading ranks, and ignore what would certainly be a burning desire to fire early. If he left it too late, then he would commit an even more fatal error. The volley would still smash the head of the charge to smithereens, the muskets capable of horrific damage at close range, yet the enemy's momentum would drive them forward. Man and horse turned into a projectile that would slam into the thin line and tear huge holes in its ordered ranks. The horsemen left intact would pour into the gaps, their naked talwars and sharpened spears capable of spreading havoc if they broke into the line. The redcoats would be easy targets, and Dutton's small command would be torn apart in a heartbeat. It would take only one volley for the charge to be bludgeoned to a bloody halt, but it had to be timed to perfection. "Company, prepare to fire." Kingsley had left the orders to his colour sergeant, deeming the act of shouting himself hoarse beneath the dignity of his rank. The redcoats pulled their muskets to their shoulders, settling the heavy stock so that they rested snugly. They peered down the simple sights, aiming the barrel so that they pointed at the throng that was speeding towards them. The staccato drumming of so many horses made the ground shudder under their feet. Along the line, the muskets wavered, the redcoats feeling the weight pull at their arms as they waited for the command to fire. The horsemen were covering the ground fast, the riders leaning forward in the saddle to urge their mounts to even greater efforts. This was no ordered attack, and some riders pulled ahead of their fellows so that the front of the charge bulged. With dreadful speed they tore over the dusty scrub, every heartbeat bringing them closer to the steady double line of men that stood silently in their path. The enemy was close enough that the redcoats could see the snarls and twisted grimaces of hate on the faces of the wild horsemen thundering towards them. Every man felt the knot of terror deep in his gut, the fear twisting through his veins. The charge seemed unstoppable, its dreadful momentum sure to rip the frail line into bloody ruin. At 150 yards, Jack forced his aching muscles to harden, stilling the slight movement in the barrel of his musket, tensing his sinews as he prepared to fire. The horsemen were moving with mesmerizing speed now, and his finger tightened on the trigger as he anticipated the order. The horsemen gouged their vicious spurs into the flanks of their tiring mounts, their soul-searing bellows of hate intensifying as they hurtled forward, the inevitable collision with the red-coated line coming closer with every bound. Jack's mind screamed the command to fire, sensing the moment for the deadly volley to be unleashed. Yet Dutton remained silent. Jack tore his eye from his musket. In desperation he looked across to where Dutton sat in the centre of the British line, staring rapt at the enemy charge that was bearing down on his small command with such dreadful purpose. Jack was close enough to see the throb of a vein in the Major's forehead, the tension in the man obvious even from 50 yards away. A surge of horror seared through his body. Dutton was leaving the volley too late, the inexperienced officer failing to judge the distance correctly. It was the worst mistake he could make.